Hey everyone, today I'm going to be responding to a recent video put up by the channel Faith Because of Reason, David Pallmann, in which he defends the position of substance dualism, so that the mind is an immaterial substance. And as a ardent materialist, I found this video, well, objectionable to say the least, and so I'm going to be responding to it here. Now, a couple of points. This is the video that I'm going to be responding to. You Are a Soul, a comprehensive defense of substance dualism. I should note that the original video is 9 hours long, and so obviously I'm going to have to be a bit abbreviated in my remarks. I'm hoping for this video to be significantly shorter than that, so I won't be able to cover everything in full detail, but I'll do my best to cover what I consider the key points. So much of my video consists of screenshots from his video, and then I'll provide response and commentary to those. I've left the time index at the bottom of the screen, so you can see where in the video I'm quoting. And sometimes I generally go in order, but sometimes I interchange the order of certain sections to present a more logical ordering in my perspective, but you should be able to follow that along. Also, I don't necessarily respond, as I said, to every single point. I'm a bit selective in areas where I think that there's an issue of agreement or something that I don't think is as important to respond to. So let me also, actually, before we get to that, let me just say something about the video itself. So the video is generally well put together. I think David's done some good work in compiling some of the major arguments in favor of substance dualism. And so although I'm going to be disagreeing with the arguments, I don't want to take anything away from the effort that was put into the video. I think that the argumentation is a lot better than you find in a lot of internet apologetics. And so I do applaud that. And the references to scholarship, although a bit one-sided at times, I do appreciate that as well. And so I want to applaud David for his efforts there. That being said, I do think that there are weaknesses in the argumentation, obviously. And so I'm going to be critiquing those. But yeah, credit where credit is due for compiling a fairly comprehensive and I think generally well put together video, albeit obviously I disagree with some of the arguments and conclusions. All right, so let's get going. And as I said, it is a 9-hour video, so I will have to keep up the pace a bit. Feel free to put questions in chat if you're listening to this live, and we'll get to those if I can, but I will be mostly going through slides here. So let's start by defining a mind. So again, I'm just taking most of these from the video, and I'll provide commentary when needed. David only defines a mind sort of a third of the way through. He defines a mind as the thing which possesses thoughts and undergoes experiences. It's rather difficult to define a mind, so this will sort of do as far as we as far as things go. The important points here are the mind is that which thinks and that which experiences, and that will do as well as anything as a starting point. So then we need to outline what are the two main competing perspectives about the nature of minds. David does introduce a number of different perspectives. He mentions idealism and there's neutral monism and things. To keep things simple in this video, I'm going to contrast substance dualism with physicalism, which is its main rival. And I'm a physicalist, particularly a reductive physicalist, which will come up at some points. So what is physicalism? So Jae-Gwon Kim here, who's a renowned physicalist, philosopher of mind, defines it here. So physicalism is the position, or materialism, he says here. I'll use those interchangeably. The position that the world consists of bits of matter and structures made up of those bits of matter, which behave in accordance with physical laws. And everything that exists is just different arrangements of that physical matter. And I think that that's a pretty good definition as far as things go. So bits of matter, we can think of those as atoms or subatomic particles if you like. Doesn't much matter for the point here. Now, that's physicalism. So the idea of physicalism is that the mind, the thing which thinks and experiences, is ultimately a physical structure or physical object or set of physical processes. We'll get to the precise detail there, but it's physical, meaning that it consists of pieces of matter like atoms and their interactions with each other. So that's what physicalism says. The mind is ultimately physical. What does substance dualism say? Substance dualism, according to the definition given here, you'll see this book is quoted quite a lot by David. Substance dualism says that a human is comprised of a soul, so that is a fundamental immaterial substance, and a physical body. So that's the dualism component. There's a physical component, physical body, and then a spiritual or soul component, the immaterial soul. That's the substance dualist part, right? And together they form a person. And so the idea here is that according to substance dualism, such a person is capable of existing without a body, but not without the soul. So the soul is what gives the sort of identity and continuity over time to that person. And dualists are often unclear about this, but I presume that they understand that a person needs a body in order to interact with the world and probably to perceive and things like that. But they can exist, at least in some form, without the body, because of the soul continues to exist even when the body dies. And then the mental life, of which is possessed and unified by the soul. So the soul is what unifies and gives rise to the mental component of life, particularly consciousness and free will and things like that. And other aspects are actuated by the physical body. Although, again, there's often not a lot of clarity as to exactly how that works, like which parts of it are material and which parts of it are immaterial. We'll come back to that a bit later. Okay, now there is a contention when talking about physicalism in terms of articulating exactly what something needs to be physical. What are the conditions for for something to be physical? This is not something that's, I think, hugely important here, but I do want to discuss it again. It is covered in the video. The two conditions that David gives here are that a physical object is extended in space and it can exist independently of anyone's awareness of it. So the second condition is obviously relevant for distinguishing something physical from something mental, which exists only in virtue of, someone thinking about it or being aware of it or perceiving it or something like that. Now, although David does indicate here that he thinks that being extended in space may be a necessary condition, he sort of equivocates a little bit, because he then sort of raises the idea that, well, maybe spatial extension isn't strictly necessary for something to be physical. Maybe it just has to exist at some point in space. As it says here, we don't necessarily need to assume that spatial extension is voluminous. I assume what he means there is like a contiguous volume of space. And therefore, spatial objects don't necessarily have to have clearly demarcated boundaries, which I think is fine. I mean, lots of things don't have clearly demarcated boundaries, like the Earth's atmosphere doesn't have a clearly demarcated boundary. And humanity doesn't have a clearly demarcated boundary of exactly where it is, right? Like it's somewhere on Earth, but exactly where, it's sort of, you could argue about that. Anyway, so that's fine. So there's sort of a definition then given here of an immaterial object to contrast it with a material object, which is sort of phrased in terms of a negation of a physical object. So immaterial objects are not extended in space and do not exist independently of anyone's awareness of them. So the second point obviously relates to something being essentially private or subjective or awareness dependent. And the first one here is evidently intended to give the idea that immaterial objects can be multiply instantiated. So a classical example of this would be like a property or an abstract object. Well, a property could be an example of an abstract object, or a number, or a universal. So like dogs, something to be a universal, like species or types of things, right? Or propositions might be another one. You don't have to think that those things are like immaterial objects, but some people do, right? So I'm just giving those as examples and relating that to multiple instantiation. Interestingly, that doesn't seem like that's going to be appealed to in the case of a soul, but we'll come back to that. So anyway, I don't know that those distinctions are actually massively important here, but it's just something to sort of crudely characterize. Again, the idea of a material object is fundamentally that it's made up of bits of matter that exist in space and that exist sort of objectively, independently of what anyone thinks or is aware of, whereas immaterial objects, and particularly relevant here to subject dualism, they're not made of matter and they are not extended in space, and they have a first person existence to them. That is, they exist in virtue of someone being aware of them, because there's a sort of a subjectivity inherent to them. And that's what's stated here again by Moreland here, that an immaterial self has no separable parts, so that's important, is a substance, so that means it's a thing, like it's a type of object as distinct from a property. So normally we say that substances are like things and properties are characteristics or aspects that things can have. So properties can be multiply instantiated, so like different objects can have the same property, but a given object can only exist like once, so it's singly instantiated. That's again the typical distinction. So substance dualism says that the soul is a substance, it's a thing. It's not a physical thing though, and it has no separable parts, so it's a simple thing. It's not like a physical thing that has different component like elements to it, matter to it. A soul has no parts to it. It's metaphysically indivisible. I don't know what this part in bracket here means. And it's not spatially extended. So it doesn't exist over space. It only exists either not in space at all, or maybe it's spatially located, but it doesn't extend over a volume of space. So we'll come back to that point a bit later. And this last point here that I've highlighted, it's essentially characterized by the properties of consciousness. So consciousness, awareness is what characterizes the nature, the essential nature of an immaterial soul, according to this idea. Okay, so hopefully that sort of reasonably well characterizes what the two positions are. Physicalism says the mind is a physical state of affairs, some sort of physical system, which means it's made up of matter and exists in some extended way in space and exists objectively, irrespective of anyone's perception of it. Whereas substance dualism says that the mind is comprised of an immaterial soul, which is simple, has no component parts, is not made of physical matter, and is not extended in space, and is essentially conscious. Like that's part of its essential property, and therefore there's always an inherent awareness to it. So obviously those are quite different conceptions. Okay. Just to clarify here, there's no video audios because I'm not playing the video. I'm playing slides from it, which I'm then commenting on. If I were to play the video and comment, it would take far too long because it is 9 hours long, as I said. Okay, so that's an introduction to characterize the positions. Now what I'm going to do is go through the four main arguments that David outlines in the video in favor of substance dualism. The first here is the argument from the nature of the self, or the argument from selves might be another way to put this. Okay, so what do we mean by selves here? What's the idea here? So Strawson defines this here. So a self is some kind of sense of ourselves as having a being, a mental presence, they say here, a someone, a perspective, a conscious subjective experience. There's lots of ways you can characterize that. I'm not going to belabor the point here. I hope you get that general idea of what's meant there. Now, this raises a question about what's called the unity of the self, right? So let me try to articulate this. Again, you can pause and read the quotes that I'm putting up if you'd like a bit more detail. I'm just trying to give the general perspective here, again, in the interest of time. Otherwise, the video will be an eternity. So what's the question here about the unity of self? What's the issue? Well, the issue is, if we think about all of the different components of like consciousness or awareness or our mental life more generally, what is it that unifies them together to make a single person? So David Hume talked about this, the idea that, you know, you have different memories, you have different perceptions of different objects or different experiences that happen to you, different sensations, perceptions. You have ideas, you make different choices, sometimes one day, sometimes the other day. And these things always change over time, right? Perceptions and memories and thoughts and all of this. Personality traits as well, moods. And the question is, what joins these all together? What binds them together and makes them the mental, and what makes them the subject of a single person? So as it says here, in virtue of what do a few of the members of this huge set belong to me? This set being like my experiences and thoughts and things like that. Why are they my thoughts and not someone else's? Like what actually distinguishes that? What unifies the self, in other words? So an obvious answer, as is stated here, is that, well, these experiences and thoughts and things belong to me, like they're mine, as distinct from someone else's, because they're connected to my body, like one particular body. Like that's an obvious answer that the physicalist is going to give, right? Well, the reason that they're your thoughts and experiences and so forth and not someone else's is because they're attached to, connected to, or caused by your body. Okay. So the dualists don't think that's satisfactory. And why do they say that? Well, they think they can't be the correct answer because one reason given here is that they think, well, again, David Lund is arguing here that in order for us to figure out that our body is our own body, he's saying that we first have to have knowledge of it through our own experience of it. I think, yes, and he goes on to articulate that here. So in other words, I know that my body belongs to me because I have experiences of it as connected to my mind. And he's saying here that this knowledge, the epistemic term, so that's relating to knowledge, what I know in knowing that E belongs to me, like my body belongs to me. I don't know why we need E here. Oh, sorry, this is an experience, not body. So an experience belongs to me. He says that you can know that an experience belongs to you distinctly from whether you know that it is connected to your body. So this is actually close to the modal argument, which we'll get to later. So he's saying here that we can know that an experience is connected to us sort of directly, irrespective of whatever we might know about whether that experience is connected to our body or not. We know directly that an experience is ours, and whether or not something is connected to our body is sort of like secondary. We don't necessarily know that in the same way or in the same by the same method, right? And because of that, he's saying that we should draw ontological implications from these epistemic facts. Ontological meaning the nature of existence in this case, or reality, as opposed to epistemic, which is the nature of knowledge. This is an important distinction because what we know is not always the same as what exists. We might know some things and not know other things, right? So our knowledge may be imperfect, or it may be just different. So the point here is because what we can know about our experiences being our own is different to how we know and what we can know about our body being our own, all those experiences connected to our body, that therefore this points to an ontological difference. And I think, yes, okay, that's actually the end of that argument. So this argument here doesn't really make any sense to me at all. So, and to be honest, we'll see David Lund appearing quite a few times, and I think that his points are often the worst of all of the philosophers quoted here. This point here about the fact that there is an epistemic difference between knowing that an experience is yours and knowing that it's connected to your body, implying an ontological distinction between an experience being yours and it being connected to your body, is entirely misconstrued. Because as we'll see later, I mean, this point comes up again. The fact that something is not epistemically transparent doesn't automatically mean that there's any ontological implications of that at all. It just means that you might not know the ontological implications of everything that you know, right? So just because you know that you have an experience and that that's your experience, maybe you think that's directly apparent to you or something, it's just sort of not obvious why it would be transparent to you that that would also be connected to your body, right? That's a further assumption that everything that we experience, we would also transparently know the ontological implications of that. And it's sort of kind of obvious that we don't, right? Like there's a lot of things that we can't introspect about the nature of our minds. The fact that there's thinking that happens in our brain, for example, like you can't introspect and know anything about your brain, but it's still there, right? So clearly there's a gap between what is the case and what we can know is the case just by introspecting. And this argument here just seems to be demolishing that gap and saying, well, no, if we can know something about our experiences, then necessarily there must be some ontological implications that if we knew that an experience was yours, then you would also know that it was connected to your body, if it was necessarily so. But that's just wrong. Like that's just an assumption that the nature of our experiences are ontologically transparent, and that's not defended here. So I think that that's an entirely fallacious argument. Now, let's move to the next point here about the nature of self. So that was kind of just like what unifies the self. The argument was that it can't be the body because we don't necessarily know that an experience belongs to our body. But again, that's just making the assumption that experiences must be ontologically transparent, which is just a silly assumption. Now, here's a more common argument, which is identity over time. It's related to what we just talked about, but it's a bit of a different way of thinking about it. So this is the idea that we, as a person, as a self, persist over time. So, you were born, you grow up, you have experiences, and as a succession of events passes, so the argument goes, maintain your identity over time, right? We think generally that we're the same person as we were yesterday or last year or whatever. So this is the idea of persistence over time. But dualists make an argument about this and to support substance dualism. So let me just go quickly through the premises here. So if something is a physical object composed of separable parts, it does not endure over time as the same object if it comes to have different parts. The grammar there is a bit odd, but so this is the ship of Theseus, right? Some of you may be familiar with this, right? So there's a ship, which gradually the planks and the sails and the ropes and everything are replaced over time. And the question is, eventually, maybe all of the parts are replaced and there's no original parts left. Is it the same ship, right? And if it is the same ship, then how does that work? What makes it the same ship if all of the parts are different? Maybe the crew's different as well. Like, what makes it the same? On the other hand, if it's not the same ship, then at what point did it cease to become? Did it cease to be the same ship and become a different ship? If you kept all the old parts and then reassembled them into another ship, would that be the original ship, or would it be two original ships now? There's lots of questions about this. This is essentially the problem of composite objects and their identity conditions over time. A very well-known, very old philosophical issue. So the claim here, which is actually a very strong claim, is that physical objects, composite physical objects, so that just means a physical object made up of different parts. So, anything with more than one atom or particle is really a composite object. Composite physical objects do not endure over time if their parts are changed. So this is a very strong position about the nature of material composition over time. And I think that we should just reject that on the face of it, or at least it's very much not obviously true, because this means no composite physical object maintains its existence over time. And so that has a lot of implications, which we'll come back to. So that's the first premise here. Second premise: my body and brain are physical objects composed of separable parts. So multiple atoms, cells, and things like that. I don't think you can deny that. 3, my body and brain therefore do not endure over time. So that's just a conclusion of the first two. So 4th here, I, human person, do endure over time as the same object. So that is essentially just an appeal to intuition. I think there's a little more on that coming up, but that's a key premise here. And 5, I am not my body or brain. Well, that just follows from 3, right? If you endure over time, but your body and brain don't, then obviously you can't be your body. And then there's a disjunction here. So I'm either a simple enduring soul or a body or a brain. And if you're not a body or a brain, then you must be a simple enduring soul. There's not really a strong reason to accept this. I'm sort of presenting that for the purpose of this video, presenting a dichotomy here, but there are other options as well. But anyway, so the point is, what's of most interest here? Premises 1 and 4. So 1 is the idea that composite physical objects do not endure over time. And 4 is the position that human persons or subjects, or minds, you could even say, do endure over time as an object that maintains the same identity. So what reason is given for accepting these two key premises here? Well, I don't think actually David even really talks about premise 1 here, if I recall correctly. As for premise 4 here, the idea that we as a person or a subject endure over time. Well, an argument is given about the nature of thought. The idea that, complex thought involves sustained mental effort, control of attention throughout its duration, thinking about different ideas, willing and directing thoughts, and so forth. And that's all fine as far as it goes. But the key point here, the continuity of this process of thinking and willing and directing attention and so forth, seems entirely dependent on the continuity of agency, which in turn renders irresistible the conclusion that the self-same agent persists throughout the process. So basically the idea that there's this continuity of a process of thinking and willing and attention giving and so forth is dependent on the continuity of agency, which in turn requires, according to this, that there's a single agent that persists throughout the process. And I think that there's a clear jump here. So we can acknowledge, I think as materialists, that in order for at least sort of normal thinking to occur, there needs to be continuity of mental processes, right? One thought leading to another, or one component of thinking leading to another, thinking through ideas and willing and maintaining attention on a task, things like that. There's a continuity. I think that that's a very plausible statement. So we might call that continuity of agency, if you like. But the problem here is that then we go from a continuity, which means a linkage or maintenance of certain aspects over time, into an identity of an agent persisting throughout the process. And it's just entirely unclear why that's an irresistible conclusion. Continuity is not the same as identity. Identity means it's exactly the same in all respects, in all essential properties at least are the same. Whereas a continuity, it just means that there's, some overlap, a sufficient overlap, probably causal processes and gradual changes so that there's not a sharp interruption. But all we need here is for there to be a continuity of agency is a continuity of physical processes. We don't need there to be an identity of self-same agent. And there's simply no argument given here. It's just asserted that we need some identity of an agent. Whereas all the premise is that there's continuity, and the conclusion is somehow just jumps out of that there needs to be an identity. It's not argued for. So I don't see what the argument is supposed to be here. It seems pure assertion. Now there is another point that's made, again by David Lund here, about the idea that we have experiences over time. As I was talking about before, our experiences change over time. But again, the argument is that we as a subject remain unified over time. And at least here's the argument that's given here. I'll do my best to present it, even though it's hard for me to even make sense of what's being said here. So we at the present, it's said here, have knowledge of ourselves from the immediate past. That's what this diagram's indicating here. Like we kind of inherit our knowledge or experiences, our memories from the immediate past, like the version of ourselves the last second or whatever. And then that version of ourselves inherited their awareness and memories and things from the version immediately prior to that, and so forth. And it sort of goes backwards. So the claim he's making here is that I am directly aware of my present, which I'm directly aware of my present self and experiences and thoughts and so forth. And not only that, but I'm somehow also aware of the fact that my immediate previous self became my present self. So there's an argument here that we're somehow not just aware of what's here now, we're aware of this process of becoming over time, of like the T-1 version of ourselves becoming the T version of ourselves becoming the T+1 version of ourselves, and so forth. We inherit that memories and awareness over time, and we're aware of that process of inheritance. And so from that, given that argument, the claim is made that we can sort of feel ourselves, we can perceive ourselves continuing to persist over time. At least, I think that this is only supposed to work at least as, we have uninterrupted periods of consciousness. So this would be between waking and sleeping at the very least. But the point is, at least over that period of time, the idea is that we sort of have this immediate sense of maintaining our identity over successive moments of time or periods of time. That's a slightly separate argument. So again, this argument here just appears to be entirely assertion. It's entirely unclear to me how you can be aware of this process of becoming the T-1 version of yourself to the present version of the self. Because all we're aware of is what we're aware of at any given time. You're not simultaneously aware of the present and the past. You're aware of each moment in time as it happens. However long a moment is exactly, that's a sort of a neuroscience question, I would argue, probably a few hundred milliseconds. But I just don't really know what this knowledge is supposed to consist of in which we have some awareness of this succession over periods of time. And even if we do grant that, it's, again, all that this implies is a sufficient continuity to be aware of your continued existence over time. I mean, the materialist can account for that. The only issue that might be for the materialist here is this notion of identity, because there's this problem of a composite object. Like, how do you define identity conditions for an object that the parts of which are changing over time? Well, here, nothing about that is identity is actually established. Again, all we've really established here is that there's a sufficient continuity over time for you to be aware of your memories and perceptions and things like that. Again, it's like having a continuity over time. There's nothing that's been established about any identity conditions. It's just kind of asserted here. So there's just not really much of an argument there. It's just sort of asserted. So this is all the defensive premise for here. We endure over time as the same object. There's no argument here. It's just assertions that, like, it kind of seems like that I'm identical over time, but no actual argument given. Now, there is another argument here. This is not the continuity over time. This is the point about indivisibility. And so, sorry, before I move on to that, I should also just mention, as far as I know, this first premise here of this identity over time argument is simply not defended. And I mentioned this in the via putting this little reference to the the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article about identity over time, which is just like the huge philosophical literature that is on this issue. And there are many physicalist answers to this question about the nature of identity over time as a human subject or as a physical object as well. So I'm partial to four-dimensionalism, actually, this idea of perdurantism, that physical objects are extended in time as well as space. But there are many other resolutions to the issue as well. And it's sort of not really clear that substance dualism is a good solution, because they still have to provide a solution for physical objects. Substance dualism only provides a solution, insofar as you think there is even a problem, to persons, but it doesn't say anything about other physical objects, like composite physical objects. So they still need a solution to that. But what I would say is, well, look, whatever solution dualists have to the problem of identity over time for composite physical objects, just take that and apply it to humans as well. And so you get a resolution of this issue. So premise one here is not defended at all, and 4 is defended just by unsubstantiated assertions that don't really have any basis. Okay, so let's move on. The third component here, the third component here, the argument from the indivisibility of the self. So we talked about the continuity of self over time. Now we're talking about the fact that the self cannot be divided. Remember, substance dualists think that the self is ultimately simple and indivisible, can't be broken down into parts. So the claim here, again, from David Lund, is that it's sort of hard to see how we can imagine a conscious state or a subject of those conscious states being divided. It is no more intelligent to claim that a subject is or might be composite as is to make such a claim about consciousness itself. The simplicity of the subject implies its indivisibility. So the idea here is that a subject, like an experiencing self, is a simple entity that you can't imagine it being divided. And it just doesn't make any sense to talk about that. And therefore, we should reason that there is no parts into which it can be divided because we can't even imagine it being divided up. And so this argument here that there's no intelligibility of the idea that a subject can be divided is a bit strange to me, because we actually have real world examples of divided subjects. Split brain experiments would be a good example of this. It is a little contentious exactly how to interpret those results, but it does appear that there's at least some division of consciousness between parts of the hemispheres of the brain when you cut the corpus callosum and inhibit the transfer of information that normally maintains unity across the hemispheres. There are also other disorders of consciousness as well, which you can read more about if you look Stanford Encyclopedia, the Unity of Consciousness article has a discussion of these. There's various disorders, including like neglect of certain parts of the visual hemisphere, for example, where people just sort of don't notice things, or inability to process attend to important things inability to attend to important information in order to make a decision. Some people just sort of really struggle with integrating that in a coherent way. So there are a variety of disorders of consciousness which at least seem to me render intelligible the idea that it can be divided to some extent. And even aside from that, I don't know, just use some imagination. Like, I just don't know what it's supposed to be so unintelligible about the idea that consciousness can be divided. So I just find this to be a completely empty argument here. Now, from Moreland here, we have the argument that relating to this, I mean, this is similar to what we were talking about before, but I'm not entirely sure why it's in this part of the video, but whatever. This is where it appeared. So there needs to be some unity, something that unifies our conscious experience and the experiences we have over time. So that's this notion of synchronically, like over time. Synchronically is at one period of time, and diachronically is over time. But anyway, the idea is what unifies the aspects of our experiences and perceptions over time. And the idea is physical objects can't do that because they're all mereological aggregates, like a combination of simple things, like combination of atoms together. The individual components are changing over time, so that can't unify the whole. And according to Moreland, the best explanation for unifying consciousness is that there is a simple, which means not composed of parts, soul. And this just comes back to the idea, even if you accept that consciousness is unified, which I think is suspect, or maybe it's unified most of the time, but the idea that it can't be divided, that's suspect. But we've also seen the point that dualists simply just don't address all of the standard arguments and positions that there are for understanding the conditions for endurance of identity of physical objects, of composite physical objects over time. That they just sort of ignore all of this and pretend that the only resolution is a simple non-physical substance of some kind, which then raises the question, how do they resolve the problem in any other sphere? So I just mentioned that before. It's very simple for a physicalist to simply say, look, this is a general issue, resolve the issue in a general context, and then whatever that solution is, apply that to the human person case. It's unclear why a solution that only works in one narrow subset of cases is somehow better. This is, again, from David Lund here, talking about the inconceivability of having two different viewpoints simultaneously. Now, this is a bit strange because in the video, it seems like, this is a bit confusing because there's two Davids here. The David who prepared this video, not David Lund here, he seems to be thinking about the idea of viewpoints as like opinions, but David Lund here appears to be talking about the idea of viewpoints as like perspectives, as in like visual perspectives. So I'm actually not sure exactly what's being referred to here, but either way, the idea here is that we can't conceive of a single subject having two different viewpoints simultaneously. Not having two bodies, but like simultaneously having distinct viewpoints. And therefore, we can't find it intelligible that a subject can be divided. So this is like a similar unity argument, but from a unity of perspective. And again, this is just mere assertion as far as I can find. Like, well, why can't you imagine that? Some animals even have eyes that are at angles to each other, such that the visual field, I think, doesn't overlap at all. And in some sense, that is having two different viewpoints simultaneously. It's just a different type of experience. Humans' eyes are closer together. Likewise, our auditory perception kind of merges it together into one experience, but really we're sensing from opposite sides of the body, right? I mean, obviously sound sort of travels around. So generally we can detect sound in both, but not always. So I just don't know what this is based on. It just seems to be entirely made up, the idea that, we can't even imagine the idea of having two different viewpoints simultaneously, whether it's a perspective, like perceptual viewpoint, or even like an opinion. I mean, you can have conflicting opinions at once. That's what it means to be to equivocate about something, or being ambivalent, right? So either way, I just don't know what this is even supposed to be appealing to. So that concludes the discussion of the first argument, which appeals to the nature of the self and the unity of self. And mostly it just amounts to saying, look, it really seems like the self is unified. It's one single thing that we maintain identity over time. And let's just ignore everything that philosophers have to say about how to resolve this question in general, and we'll pretend that the only solution is a single, simple, immaterial self. It's just a giant nothing burger of an argument, as far as I can tell. There's just a couple of... I refuse to think I exist. There's a couple of people in chat here raising concerns about whether selves exist. So I think you can have a fairly minimalist notion of the self as just like a person, right? And like as distinct from other people. And so I don't really think that the physicalists should have a problem with the notion of selves. Personally, I don't think that self-talk is very useful, but like a person, particularly referring to their mind, personality kind of things. And yeah, we want to know, like, well, what is it that makes one person the same person over time? And that's the issue that dualists have. But I don't think that their answer is any good, and it's not clear that it's a problem that's in any way special to minds, because any composite physical object will have the same issue here. All right, let's move on to the second argument, the argument from introspection. So where's my slideshow here? Okay, so the argument from introspection, this is what David calls it here, but it's more, perhaps a better name for this would be an argument from inconsistent properties of the mental and the physical, but you'll see what I mean there. So here's one presentation of this argument from Moreland here. So premise one, my mental states are knowable by introspection. Premise two, my brain states are not knowable by introspection. Therefore, by Leibniz's law, my mental states are not identical with my brain states. Leibniz's law states that if two things are identical, they must have all properties in common. And so this is a property that's different, obviously, between mental and brain states, if you accept these premises. And so then brain states can't be identical, or mental states can't be identical to any brain state, according to this. Here is a slightly different variation of the argument, which I think is a little better. So we'll use this one. So my mental states are knowable by introspection. Now, I think that premise is too strong because definitely not all mental states are knowable by introspection, unless you define the mental as being only the conscious mental experiences. And I think that that's an odd definition, but that's fine. We can modify that and just say, like, some of my mental states are knowable by introspection, and we can use that going forward. So some of my mental states are knowable by introspection. Physical states are not knowable by introspection. So that's going to be the key premise there. I mean, some of you might have an issue with this. Again, I'm happy to say that we have some knowledge of our mental states by introspection. I don't see that that's a problem for a physicalist. However, premise two here, physical states are not knowable by introspection. Obviously, if you accept that, then by Leibniz's law, you're going to have a problem saying that a mental state is identical with any physical state. Now, then there's an additional premise here added to kind of get dualism out of that by saying, well, look, if they're not identical with physical states, then mental states must be non-physical or immaterial. And so therefore they must be immaterial. Now, maybe there's a third option there, but again, that's not going to interest us too much here because I'm mostly going to focus on the dichotomy between physicalism and substance dualism. So that's why I've identified two here as the key premise here. So is it true that physical states are not knowable by introspection? What's going on here? Oh, yes. So I just excerpted a couple of quotes from David here in the video. So this is from the audio of the video. It makes little sense to ask how far in space one of my mental states extends. He also says, when I close my eyes and imagine a blue sky, I'm seeing things which have properties which are not possessed by my brain or any other part of my body. The blueness of the sky is not to be found in my brain. So this is an argument here for physical states not being knowable by introspection. Now, I've identified here a point that I mentioned earlier, that at the outset, when we were defining what it is for something to be physical, we noted that we don't we shouldn't assume that spatial extension is voluminous and spatial objects have clearly demarcated surfaces. I think that what David is saying here is inconsistent with that, because he's asking rhetorically, how far in space one of my mental states extends. Well, that's a silly question to ask, because mental states, according to the physicalists, do not have a defined physical location. Not a well-defined physical location, at least. I think you could broadly say that your mental states are located where your brain is located. Maybe if you can localize them to part of your brain sometimes, not always. We might not be able to define precisely where that is, but like broadly speaking, we can. You could argue maybe embodied cognition, mental states sometimes extend to other parts of the body, that you could argue that, but like you can at least broadly define where they're located. You don't have to precisely demarcate them, as again, David seems to agree here. Many physical objects will not have precisely demarcated physical boundaries, so that's not an issue. So I think that this is a red herring as an argument. It's just irrelevant that you can't precisely specify exactly where your mental states are extended to. You can roughly localize them, and that's all you need for most physical objects, most physical systems. Now, this second point here about the idea that, this is why I say it's really an inconsistent properties argument. He's saying that mental states, like imagining the blue sky, have properties that are just not possessed by brain states, because like there's no colors in the brain, right? Blueness of the sky is not to be found in the brain. Well, this appears to be begging the question against the physicalist, right? I mean, the physicalist says that the blueness of the sky is to be found in the brain. Not literally like you poke around there and you like turn over a neuron and like there's blue under there or something. I mean, obviously that's not how it works. I've just thrown up a little diagram here of the visual system. Information is processed coming from the retina and passes, your retina's here, passes through the lateral geniculate nucleus and the thalamus, and then through the visual cortex, different layers, cells of different layers process different types of information and line orientations and colors and things like that. It's all very complicated and still not fully understood. But the point is that experience of blueness, according to the physicalist, is constructed progressively through the processing of information and representations of that stimulus over different parts of the cortex. So, I mean, yeah, the physicalist says the blueness of the sky is to be found in your brain, in a distributed way across a complex pattern of activity over neurons, when subject to the right stimulus, or maybe when we're imagining it. I just don't know what the argument is that it's not to be found in your brain. Like the physicalist says, yeah, it is. It's just, it's complicated. It's not a simple physical state. It's not like a rock that you can just say it's composed of crystalline matter lumped together. Like it's a very complex interplay of neural activity. But yeah, it's in the brain. So I just don't see what the argument is supposed to be here. It's just pure assertion. Now, this is, I think, one of the worst examples of what we'll see throughout this video, which is that dualists just do not seem to understand or care anything about neuroscience, cognitive science, or science of any sort, really. That's not always true, but there are many examples where that appears to be the best explanation. And this quote is a good example of this. So consider a thought in your mind, focus on it, see what it is about. Like imagining the blue sky, for example, we can imagine the tone of blue and the clouds, rolling by, and we can imagine, maybe what we're smelling or experiences associated with that. We can have a rich mental sensation. That's all fine, right? We can distinguish this thought from other thoughts that you have about other things. So there's different thoughts we can have, different experiences and memories. Again, that's all fine. Now he says, by contrast, consider bits of your brain. You do not have direct conscious awareness of third-person bits of your brain. These observations expose a salient difference between the first-person aspects of your thoughts and the third-person aspects of your brain. So again, difference between properties of the brain, properties of the mind. They're going to say that means that they can't be the same, right? Leibniz's law. That's the argument here. So, but I want to highlight here the idea that we think of bits of our brain. Who talks like that? Like what is a bit of our brain? You mean like regions? Neural networks? Like, what are we talking about exactly here? I don't know what a bit of our brain is. Like, that just strikes me as sort of a bit illiterate there. Now, of course, we don't have third-person access to like bits of our brain. What we have access to is some of our thoughts, right? But the physicalist says that thoughts are identical, at least token-wise identical. I'll come back to that distinction later. Our thoughts are identical to certain physical states. The physicalist certainly doesn't have to say, and I think shouldn't say, that thoughts are identical to bits of our brain. You see the difference here? A bit of your brain is a physical object or parts of a physical object. And dualists seem to only be able to think about the mind and the brain as like a bit of the brain, like a physical object. And they say, well, a thought is not like a physical object, is it? Well, no, and therefore they can't be identical. The physicalist doesn't say that thoughts are bits of your brain. The physicalist says that thoughts are complex physical states. And a way to make that more specific would be a thought is a complex pattern of neuroelectrical activity distributed across a range, a large number of neurons in your brain. That's what a thought is, something like that. Maybe there's more detail you could give, but it's not a bit of your brain. And this makes a huge difference, right? As we'll see later, because a lot of the arguments here appeals to intuition. And if your intuitive knowledge of what a brain is just like bits of matter, and the physicalist just thinks that a thought is just this bit of the brain or this other bit of the brain, of course it's going to be, you're not going to think it's intuitive or possible that thoughts could be material. But that's just such a gross mischaracterization of physicalism or materialism about the mind. That's not what physicalists think. Physicalists think that mental states are identical, at least token-wise identical, to certain physical states. And those physical states are characterized as complex patterns of activity, not as just like a bit of your brain. This is a really important distinction that substance dualists seem to miss, or at least most of them. Now, there's a counter to this argument about this inconsistent properties by Churchland here, which I think is a very good one. So we can recognize that aspirin is a pain reliever, whereas we may not recognize that acetylsalicylic, this one's hard, acetylsalicylic, geez, I should know this better. Acetylsalicylic acid is not recognized by John to be a pain reliever. These are the same thing though. So aspirin is just this chemical. So the point is we can recognize one to be a pain reliever, but not the other one. And so if we reasoned in the same way as the dualists are reasoning, we would say, well, aspirin is not identical to this chemical. That's obviously an invalid inference, right? And this is just highlighting the fact that one way to articulate this is the difference between sense and reference. This is an old idea in philosophy of language. The idea that's usually given is Venus. So the morning star is the star that's often, or the planet really, that's seen in the sky near the sun in the morning. And the evening, I think I got that wrong right here. Morning star, planet seen near the sun in the morning. Evening star, planet that's seen near the sun in the evening. Now, it turns out the morning and the evening star are both Venus, right? They're the same thing, but they appear at different times. So you might not know that the morning and the evening star are both the planet Venus. So something in the world can appear in different ways. We can have knowledge of it through different modes of presentation. So that's a different sense of the word. And we may not know that those two senses refer to the same thing. So this is an instance of that here. We don't know that aspirin is this particular chemical, but that doesn't mean that it isn't, just because we don't know that it is. We recognize one, but not the other. Now, there's a response here from Churchland, which says, well, look, it seems that this, there's another example here, Muhammad Ali and Cassius Clay, right? They're the same, but you might not know that they're the same. Now, he's saying here, well, look, this error is due to lack of propositional knowledge about the reference of certain names, which I think is plausibly true. It's like we don't know that these terms refer to the same thing, right? Now, however, he argues here, how is it that it's not the same when it comes to introspecting about the mind or our experiences? Because he says, how is it that when we're attending to and reflecting about our mental states, they seem to stand in relations to me like having certain properties that are not at all like the properties or relations of brain states? Oh yeah, and he continues here, the only account Churchland can give assumes that we cannot know the basic nature of our own mental states by paying attention to them, but that's too skeptical about introspection. Now, this is a very silly point, and let me explain why this is a very, very silly point, except, Churchill gives this explanation for me. If mental states are indeed brain states, it is really brain states that we've been introspecting all along. We just don't realize it because we don't have a full understanding of everything, right? So another way to put this is that Moreland here is saying, look, it's not plausible that we could be so ignorant of the nature of introspecting about our own minds. Now, maybe we could dispute that, but we don't even need to, right? Because understand the mistake Moreland is making here. Moreland is saying that there's a difference. He says it right here. There's different properties and relations of physical states and brain states compared to mental states. He's saying that mental states have these properties and relations, brain states have these properties and relations, and they're not the same. So those properties and relations aren't the same, so therefore they can't be the same as each other. The brain and the mind can't be the same as each other. How does but he defends that by saying, look, we introspect on the mind and we know what properties and relations it has. And they don't seem like the properties and relations that the brain has. And when pressed on this, he says, well, but we can be really confident about the introspection, about the nature of our mental states. We can't be that skeptical about it. But what's he missed here? We also need to be very confident about the properties and relations of the brain states. Otherwise, we don't know if they're the same thing, right? Like we might know everything about our mental states by introspecting, hypothetically. You might have a perfect knowledge of them, but you also have to have that knowledge of the brain states in order to say that they're different. You can't say that two things are different by only knowing one of them. You've got to know the other one too. And this is exactly what Churchill is saying here. He's saying, look, these mental states that we supposedly know so much about by introspection, they are just these brain states. You just didn't realize them because you didn't know enough about the brain states. You can't just introspect about the brain states because they're a different way of presenting the mental states. So we can introspect about the mental states. We are introspecting about the brain states, but we don't realize it because it's a different way of presenting the same reality. He talks about this here. We can learn about and recognize those states under familiar mentalistic descriptions, and we don't know enough about the underlying neurophysiological descriptions to realize that they're the same thing, right? This point will come up again when we get to the knowledge argument. But the fundamental flaw of this sort of inconsistent properties introspection objection is that it appeals to our confident knowledge and deep knowledge of the nature of our mental states gained through introspection, and contrasts that with the apparent difference between properties of brain states compared to mental states. But it doesn't explain how we achieve the requisite deep knowledge of brain states, which we would need in order to say that they're different. Because, of course, the physicalist is going to say, well, every time we're introspecting about a mental state, we are introspecting about a brain state. We just don't realize it because we don't know enough about the brain states through the way that we study brain states. It's kind of a different way of looking at the same thing. But just like the astronomer who doesn't realize that the morning and the evening star are the same thing, we don't realize that, or at least some people don't realize that the mental states and the brain states are actually the same thing. And you can introspect as much as you like about the mental state, but unless you also learn more about the nature of the brain state, you're not going to realize that they're the same thing. So this argument fundamentally fails because it doesn't appreciate that in order to show that two things are different, you have to know sufficiently about both of them and not just one of them. So you can appeal to introspection till the cows come home. That will only tell you about one side of the ledger. And this point that Churchill makes here is just completely ignored. I just emphasize that David doesn't respond to it in the video, which I think is a shame because I think it really gets to the meat of the point there. Not sure why I had that slide there. Okay, now there's a separate argument that's made about introspection. So the first one was essentially an inconsistent properties argument, that mental states have certain properties which brain states don't, and therefore they can't be the same. Well, we've established that that's just question begging because you can know everything you like about mental states, but maybe they're actually just physical states and we don't realize them because our knowledge is imperfect. And you can't establish that just by introspecting about the mental state side of things. Just like you can't determine whether the morning and the evening star are the same just by looking at the morning star. You've got to look at the evening star as well and compare them. That's the analogy there. Now, here's a different argument. Every physical state of affairs, our knowledge is oh, sorry, I read that wrong. So for every physical state of affairs, our knowledge is fallible. So we could be wrong about the knowledge of that physical state, right? But knowledge of at least some of my mental states is infallible. So at least some of my mental states are not physical states. So this is an epistemic argument. It's saying that all knowledge of physical states is fallible, which I broadly agree with. Maybe there's an exceptions, but I can't think of what one might be. So I'm generally happy with premise one. But premise two here, knowledge of at least some of my mental states is infallible. Well, let's have a look at that. So where's the next slide gone here? Oh, yeah. Oops. Oh, okay. Yeah. And so here is what David has to say about that. I've never yet come across any objection to this premise, which I should have put here, but I'm pretty sure is premise one here. Let alone an account of how one might obtain infallible knowledge of physical objects. Presumably, whatever knowledge we have of physical objects is mediated by sensory experience, which can be fallible, and so it goes on. Now, insofar as we're talking about physical objects, I would agree with this, right? But this goes back to the same distinction I was making before about a physical state versus a physical object. And again, dualists seem to flip-flop about this all the time, but they're very different. An object is not the same as a state. A state is just some configuration of physical stuff, at a given moment in time. Whereas an object, well, it's hard to define what an object is, but I'll just leave your intuition to think about what an object is. A physical object might be the brain, whereas a physical state is a specific brain state, configuration of electrochemical activity and all that. You see the difference between those things. A physical state is much more specific, whereas an object is a bunch of stuff, right? So I think it's true that we don't have infallible knowledge of any physical objects, but that goes back to what I was saying here. So for every physical state of affairs, knowledge is fallible. So I said before that I can't think of an exception to that, but I misspoke here. So what I meant to say is that if you're thinking about most physical states of affairs, that's going to be true. But the physicalist, remember, thinks that mental states are physical states. So they're going to say, well, look, most physical states of affairs, we can only have fallible knowledge of them, but there are some that we can have infallible knowledge of, namely those that correspond to our mental states, because your mental state is just a physical state, right? So this argument just seems to be question begging against the physicalist. The physicalist obviously thinks, insofar as you think that you can have infallible knowledge of some mental states, we'll just grant that for the sake of argument. Well, that just means that you've got infallible knowledge of the corresponding physical state. You might not know all of them. It doesn't mean you know everything about the physical state. Just we talked about before, there's different modes that a physical state can present to you. So you might know it through one guise, but not the other guise. You know it through the guise in which it presents itself to you as a mental state, but you might not know the underlying neurophysiology of it. But again, that doesn't mean that you don't have infallible knowledge of that part of it that presents itself directly to you. It's entirely question begging, right? There's just no argument given here as to why we can't have infallible knowledge of certain physical states if those just are our brain states, right, that correspond to other mental states. So the physicalist is just going to say, yeah, we can have infallible knowledge of those insofar as they're the corresponding brain states. So it's just a question-begging argument. Okay, so we're going to pause there. So we've gone through two arguments now. The first one was the appeal to the properties of the self, particularly continuity over time. The second argument was appeals to introspection, which was mostly about inconsistent properties between the mental states and physical states. So the next argument that we're going to get to is the one that he devotes the most time to in the video, David does, is the modal argument. I put zombie in brackets here. That's not from the video, but it's mainly just to help remember, because in the literature, this is often talked about in the context of conceivability and zombies. Sometimes it's also called the modal argument, but it's essentially the same thing. Okay, so how does this argument go? I think this is, so this is the presentation that he gives. Let me just grab some water here. My mind is essentially either material or immaterial. This is actually quite a packed premise here. We'll come back to that. If it is logically possible for my mind to exist apart from anything material, then my mind is not essentially material. So again, there's quite a lot here, so we need to be careful. It took me a while to think through this, so I want to try to articulate what I think is where the issue is with this argument, because it's maybe not entirely obvious. The notion essentially here is doing a lot of work. I first read essentially as just meaning like mostly or primarily or something like that. It's essentially this, often we use it as a qualifier to just mean like most importantly or something like that, but that's not what it's meant here. Essentially here means is if referring to the difference between essential and accidental properties. So an essential property is, in philosophy, something that an object, a property that an object has that cannot change, or if it were to change, the object would cease to be the same object. So it's something that is essential to the identity of that object. Whereas an accidental property is a property that can change and the object still maintain its identity. So location is generally like considered an accidental property. Maybe color for a lot of things would be accidental. That can change depending on the lighting. But essential properties will be properties that couldn't change and whilst maintaining the identity conditions of that object. Hard to give an example because I think any example is going to be controversial. But maybe an electron needs to be negatively charged and have a certain mass and spin and things like that. Those are essential properties. Otherwise, it's just not an electron, right? Whereas it can move around, it can be different places, momentums, those are accidental, but the essential properties characterize what it is. Bit harder to give examples for composite objects, but you can think about what those might be. Maybe for a species, it's having a certain genetic code or something like that. Anyway, so that's important here because what this is saying is that a mind is essentially, so its essential properties are either those of a material object or an immaterial object or substance, maybe object or subject. I don't know that it's super important for this particular argument. Now, note that this premise here is actually packing in a lot. It may seem like a simple disjunction, but it isn't because of this word essentially. So if you delete the word essentially here, then maybe you'd say, look, that's fine. It's either material or immaterial. Well, you could say, isn't it a bit of both, right? But particularly when you add the essentially here, that bit of both becomes more important because an object could have no essential properties, or at least the essential properties that it has, your mind rather, may not have an essentially material or immaterial nature. Its nature may not essentially be either. This is an exceptionally important point because it sort of undermines the whole argument if you acknowledge that a mind may have an essential nature which is neither material or immaterial. So that doesn't mean that the mind is not material or immaterial. It just means that it's not essentially material or immaterial. So there's a big difference. Essentially means that it has to be that way and cannot change. It doesn't mean that. So if something is not essentially material or immaterial, it may still always be material in practice. It just means that it's possible for it to be immaterial, or vice versa, right? Essentially is what it's sort of, that's why it's called the modal argument. It's about modal properties and what cannot change, what's retaining its identity. So saying that the mind is essentially either material or immaterial is making a strong claim about the modal nature of material and immaterial objects. It's saying that if something is material, it's essentially material, and if it's immaterial, it's essentially immaterial. And I think there will be further discussion of this, but that's actually a very strong premise, which I personally think is maybe not as plausible as it seems. Okay, and then that's where we go to the second premise here. If it is logically possible for my mind to exist apart from anything material, then my mind is not essentially material. So this premise here is, I think, correct because of the word essentially here. So I think that if you delete the word essentially, this premise is easy to deny, because it might be that your mind is material, but it's possible for it to exist without anything material. So what is different to what's possible, and that's what modality is about, possibility, like things possibly being different. And the word essentially here means that if your mind is essentially material, that means that it cannot cease to be material whilst still being your mind. So this is just saying here that if it were possible for your mind to exist without anything material, then it would not be essential for your mind to be material, which, yes, I think that is true. That's really just an explanation of what essentially material would mean. So yeah, this premise 2 here is, I think, true by definition, at least understanding essentially is the way I've understood it, which just means that like it's logically possible to be different. So premise 3 here then, it is logically possible for my mind to exist apart from anything material. Well, that's claiming that your mind has this modal property of being logically possible of existing even though nothing material existed. And then if you are apply these 2 premises, you just get that your mind is not essentially material, which means because of this disjunction here that it's essentially immaterial. The key premise here is really premise 3. This, I think, premise 2 here is really true by definition. And 1 here is setting up a disjunction, which we don't need to accept and I think can be challenged. However, it's really premise 3 here that's the argument against materialism, at least. Maybe if you reject premise 1, you don't get to substance dualism, but you can at least present this as an argument against materialism, which is how it's often run, rather than specifically be an argument for dualism. So that's what we're going to focus on in this premise 3. It's logically possible for my mind, or a mind if you like, to exist apart from anything material. So a physicalist is generally going to deny this, right? But you know, there's different possible moves here. So let's talk about this. So Jago and Kim here, this is a brief talk about discussion of the first premise here. He says here, if anything is a material object, being material is part of its essential nature. It cannot exist without being a material object. So he's in agreement with premise 1 there. I'm not really sure that I agree with that, because I don't know that something being a material object means that that's an essential part of its nature. It seems possible to me that something could be accidentally material. That is, it would be possible to be different. But this is a different defense of that first premise there. If bodies are by definition physical objects, sorry, I skipped a bit too far here. If a body becomes non-physical, then it may no longer be a body if bodies are by definition physical objects. But what I am proposing is that bodies may not be essentially physical, and so may not be essentially bodies. So this is a philosopher who's objecting potentially to this premise here. I'm sure many readers will detect this idea of out of hand. They will be sure that physical objects such as bodies are essentially physical. I'm not sure that that's so obvious, but what is the source of this conviction? It's not obvious to me that physical objects are essentially physical, and I'm not aware of any serious argument for this thesis. This is actually kind of what I would say. I'm not sure about the idea of saying that a body is not essentially physical, but it sort of depends how you define body. Like if you define it as bits of matter, then well, I guess that's essentially physical. But the idea here is that you might define, say, a body as a certain set of functions that relate capacities of like movement together. In which case, it's sort of not obvious that that needs to be physically instantiated. And this is the general direction that I would go down for actually a lot of complex physically instantiated states, like mental states, for example. I would define them in abstract functional terms in terms of what they do and how they relate to other things, which doesn't actually say anything about how they're instantiated. And this is a common approach actually to thinking about the mind called functionalism, which essentially thinks about the mind as a set of functions like perception and memory and attention and decision-making, problem-solving, and so forth. And you can break those down into more subsidiary functions and look at the context in which that function is being manifested. And you can talk about what all of those components do and how they relate to each other without saying how they're implemented at a physical level. And indeed, again, hypothetically at least, possibly, not saying this is actually the case, but possibly you could imagine those functions being instantiated by something that's not physical, in which case you would say that it's not an essential component that a mind is physical. It may be that all minds are actually physical, right? But it's not essential to their nature. You see, if we define their nature in functional terms, which abstracts away from the physical implementation, I think you can actually do this for a lot of physical things that are defined in an abstract functional way. This is one of the reasons why I am not as convinced about premise one here, because you don't need to define a physical system, at least many physical systems do not need to be defined in terms of their physical substrate. They can be defined in terms of relations and functions, which can then be instantiated in different ways, at least hypothetically. Again, not saying that they actually are, but at least modally they could be. It's possible. So this here is raising a point about wait, why is this in here? I don't actually know why this slide is in here. Yeah, I think that I just put this in here because this is sort of the only response that's given to this point here, that it's sort of not clear that a physical, a mind is essentially physical, or really that any physical object is essentially physical. This is referring back to the ship of Theseus and sort of just saying, well, look, what is it that could make it the same thing after all of the pieces have been replaced? Indeed, what could make it the particular ship of Theseus, or any ship, or indeed any material thing at all? So it's sort of saying here, like, what could ground the nature of something physical if it's not essentially physical? And I would give the argument that I just gave. You can define many, and not all, but many types of physical systems or states in terms of abstract, functional, relational, or structural characteristics, which are not dependent, not directly dependent, not essentially dependent on how they are physically instantiated. Another example of this is the famous example in mereology, that the study of parts and wholes, of the lump and the statue. So the idea is you have a lump of clay, someone molds it into a statue, and then later on, someone comes and breaks it up and breaks it into pieces. And so notice that what happens here is the clay existed, and it was formed into a statue, and then it was torn down again or broken up. And we sort of want to say that, on the one hand, we want to say that the clay is the statue. Like, it's not like the clay, the statue is something else. Like, the statue just is the clay shaped together. But at the same time, it seems like the clay existed for a while without being a statue, and then the clay was the statue, and then the statue was broken up, and the statue ceased to exist as a statue, but the clay still exists. So it seems like that the identity identity condition here is a bit strange, because it seems like we want to say that the statue is identical to the clay, and yet sometimes the clay also existed without the statue existing. But how can that be? If they're identical to each other, they should have overlapping properties, right? So there's a tension here, and I mean, there's many ways of resolving this. Obviously, I mentioned this before. This relates to an area of philosophy called mereology, the study of relation of parts to wholes. Whole as in WHOLES, by the way. And also it relates to continuity of composite physical objects over time. So there's a lot to be said there. And the point is that we can give whatever answer we like to those, and that's going to be our answer. It's not really clear that the only answer we can give relates to physical objects being essentially physical. So I think that this premise is just really under-defended here. Now, moving on to a second point here. Sorry, let me just quickly check something. So there's another objection to this argument, which I mean, I could have put elsewhere, but let's just go with it here. So this is called the inversion response. So remember that this argument, let me just jump back again. The key premise here is 3. It is logically possible for my mind to exist apart from anything physical. And from that, we get that the mind is not essentially material or not essentially physical. But there's this objection that you can just invert this argument. Indeed, you can invert any modal argument like this. So maybe it's conceivable that you can have a mind without a body or without anything physical. But it seems that it's also conceivable that you might be identical with the body, or at least some part of the body. And we can conceive of this in the way that dualists say that we can conceive of the opposite. And so it seems that we have an impasse here. We've got 2 modal arguments which have the opposite conclusion. It's conceivable that we could be a mind without a body or without any physical substrate. On the other hand, it's conceivable that we could just be identical to our body. And from that, it would follow that it's impossible that the mind could be immaterial. So same approach, but different conceivability arguments gets the opposite conclusion. And so some philosophers conclude that, well, look, it's not obvious why one is better than the other. They kind of cancel each other out, and you just have to sort of move on. So that's the inversion argument. You invert the modal argument and then get the opposite conclusion. Now, how does David respond to this? Well, essentially, they just deny that you can imagine being identical with your body, which, I mean, let's see what they say here. So to imagine a state of affairs is to imagine something positive, clear, and determinate. We'll come and talk more about this notion of imagining or conceivability in a moment. But the idea is that you're supposed to imagine it positively, so like a conception in your mind of what it is, clearly, determinately, like reasonably specific, and you can specify in terms that exclude the presence of my former body. So this is the idea that, look, the dualist can think very clearly about what it is to be a mind and exclude and not and they can do that in a way that excludes there being a body. So they think they can do that imagining that you exist without a body. But, he says, the materialist imagining his body is more problematic. I mean, what are we to picture? What are we to picture the absence of a non-physical being? Oh, sorry, how? I can't read. How are we to picture the absence of a non-physical being? So the argument here is that it's just sort of not clear how you positively, determinately, and clearly imagine that you are identical to your brain or body or something. And therefore, the claim here is that it's not conceivable that you are identical to your body in the same way that it's conceivable that you could exist without your body. So that's breaking the tie in the modal argument, right? And they want to say the dualist version goes forward, but the materialist version doesn't. Now, to this, I would say, we'll see more about this in a moment, but this notion that it's that they can clearly, positively, and determinately imagine their mind existing without the body is nonsense, because they don't imagine that at all. All they do is imagine the mind and then just not imagine anything else. To say that it's somehow a problem to, like, how are we to picture the absence of a non-physical being? Well, how are you to imagine the presence of a non-physical being, right? It's sort of unclear how the fact that it's borderline unintelligible how to imagine a non-physical being, that's somehow an argument for the existence of a non-physical being. Like, that doesn't really make sense. The fact that that is not really an intelligible or imaginable notion is a strike against the dualist. And indeed, this is a strange way to state this anyway. All the physicalist has to imagine is that they are their body. Whenever they think something, there's some neural activity that happens. There's a strict correlation between the two, necessary and sufficient condition, and that's all there is, right? You don't need to sort of not imagine a non-physical being, or how are we to picture the absence of a non-physical being? This is silly, right? Because by this definition, whenever you imagined two things as being the same, you would have to imagine the absence of everything that they aren't. Like if I was to say that a cell was just comprised of biochemical chemical reactions, I would somehow have to imagine the absence of elan vital, like a vital substance. But no, you don't need to imagine the absence of all the things that it isn't. You just need to imagine the things that it is. And it seems that the physicalists can do that. They can imagine the direct correspondence of physical states to mental states. And insofar as we're going, I mean, I don't really like this conceivability argument, but insofar as we're going to use that, it seems like the physicalists can do it just as well, if not better, than the dualists can. And this argument here that they have to imagine the absence of a non-physical thing is nonsense. So you see how this is question begging. The materialist does not need to imagine the falseness of dualism. All they need to do is imagine that the mind and the body are the same thing, that mental states are always physically instantiated. The dualist, on the other hand, is imagining the mind, and they're just not imagining the body. So it seems that if anyone's imagining an absence, it's the dualist here, because they just sort of, the body just poofs away. They're not actually imagining a non-physical soul. I mean, how do you even do that, right? They're just imagining a mind and not imagining anything else. So if anything, it seems like this imagining is problematic on the dualist side, not on the physical side, because the physicalist just has to imagine two things that we know something about: thoughts, right, and physical states, right? And you imagine both of those. Maybe you need to know a little bit about brains to imagine it well, but you get the point. Whereas what does a dualist have to imagine? Well, they have to imagine thoughts and then some like non-physical substance. Like, how do you imagine that? That seems like nonsense to me. And it seems really all they do is they imagine the thoughts and they don't imagine the body. So if anything, this objection goes through against the dualist, but at the very least, it doesn't seem like it's much of an objection against the physicalist to me. And this is really all there is an objection to that. Okay, no, I tell a lie. That's the main objection. There's a secondary objection here, which is just sort of asserted. There are no thought experiments or hypotheticals which support the possibility premise of the reverse modal argument. So this is David talking here. He says that, look, we, the dualists, have all of these thought experiments and hypotheticals which establish that it's at least possible that that minds can exist without brains or bodies. I'll get to those in a minute. We haven't gone through what they are, but there's a whole bunch of them. But, David is saying, there are no such equivalent thought experiments or hypotheticals which support the premise of the reverse modal argument. To which I would say, well, first of all, it's not that hard to think of some. But we don't really, I mean, maybe they're not much discussed in the literature, I'm not sure. But if that's true, it's just because this is what we get from science. Like science tells us about all of the correlations between mind and brain and the ways in which you can intervene in the brain through chemicals, through brain surgery, through traumatic events that happen, like traumatic brain injury, through transcranial magnetic stimulation, or just through learning over your lifetime, like neuroplasticity. All of these different effects that allow us to measure and intervene and establish associations, even causal associations between mental and activity and brain activity. And all of the diverse knowledge we have about the operation of the brain and how it relates to the mind. We don't need thought experiments, because we have all this empirical evidence. Now, I'm not saying that empirical evidence directly proves physicalism, because physicalism is a further claim that there is nothing else beyond that, right? It is a philosophical claim, but all you need to do is sort of think about those correlations, all that empirical evidence, and then kind of not think about anything, think, well, and that's all there is. You just add and that's all there is clause, essentially. That's all that's happening. You don't need all these silly hypotheticals. See, all the substance dualists have is hypotheticals because they have literally zero empirical evidence for anything. Well, thought experiments and intuitions is really all they have. So this is a very silly objection. The reason we don't have typically hypotheticals and thought experiments is the physicalists don't need them. They have actual empirical evidence, and all we need to do really is point to this and then add the and that's all there is kind of claim to it. So I think that this is an incredibly superficial and silly objection, that physicalists don't need to resort to this because we just sort of point to cognitive science and neuroscience and say that, look, all we need to do is conceive that that's all that there is happening. And that's how thought experiment, right? It's sort of weird that, and we'll see this later on, that substance dualists seem obsessed with these thought experiments and intuitions, but as soon as and that's their empirical evidence, sitting and thinking about something, but as soon as there's actual scientific evidence, they are incredibly dismissive of that. They don't care anything about it. Again, I'm not saying that you can establish the truth of physicalism just through scientific evidence, but I'm saying it's highly relevant to the discussion. And I would say often much more trustworthy to appeal to that well-done science than it is to appeal to thought experiments and conceivability arguments and intuitions. So it's sort of odd how dismissive substance dualists often are about that. Anyway, so that's the inversion argument. Now we're going to defensive premise 3. Let me just remind you where we're at here. We're looking at the modal argument, or essentially the conceivability argument for substance dualism. We've talked briefly about whether it is that a physical object is essentially physical, and although some physicalists think so, I'm not as convinced by that. But I think the key premise here is 3. It is logically possible for my mind to exist apart from anything material. We looked at the inversion version of that, which would be an argument for physicalism, and we saw the objection there. It's pretty lacking. But now we're going to have a direct defense of premise 3. So why is it that we should think that it's possible for the mind to exist without a brain, or indeed without any physical substrate? There are 4 different types of intuitions or thought experiments or scenarios that David gives us. Let's go through them quickly. So the conceivability of disembodied existence. This is the first one. So this example here relates to near-death experiences. So some philosophers appeal to this as evidence for dualism. If consciousness continues after the body has died, then it would seem that the mind can exist by itself. Now he's not saying here that near-death experiences are actually much evidence for substance dualism. The point here is that he's saying we can understand what claimants of substance dualism are saying. They seem to be coherent as experiences, right? Which he is saying suggests that they're conceivable, right? We can conceive of what people are saying by the idea of they continue to exist or see or perceive or hear after they died, right? So the fact that they're conceivable indicates that they're possible. I should say here that we're going to need to make a link between conceivability and possibility, which is a huge part of this argument here. So note that this premise here is saying it is logically possible, that's a modal claim, hence the argument name, it is logically possible for my mind to exist apart from anything material. In order to argue for that, what we have here is a series of conceivability statements or imaginability statements relating to the idea of disembodied existence or other related ideas. And then there's going to be a claim that if we can conceive of something, it must be possible. So that's the modal claim. So there's actually two claims here. There's a conceivability claim and a modal claim. And in the literature here, I think actually David here does a relatively, well, look, he sort of covers this, but he doesn't do it justice for such a widely discussed issue. There's two common responses from physicalists about this. They either deny the conceivability of these thought experiments, or they deny that the conceivability implies their possibility. Or you could, of course, deny both, but as a physicalist, you generally need to deny at least one. So the first one here is just that we can conceive of disembodied existence. You can conceive of existing with no physical substrate at all. Here's another example of this. So my existing with only mental and phenomenal properties in a world that just appears like our world is prima facie, on the face of it, conceivable. So you can imagine it. It seems easy to form a comprehensive, explicit, detailed conception of my continuing to have a variety of experiences in apparent independence of all material things. So you should imagine having experiences of all sorts of stuff, even though there's no physical reality. You could imagine being fooled by a Cartesian demon, for example, that's giving you all these hallucinations, even though you have no actual physical body. So a different thought experiment here is a body swap thought experiment. This is a scene from Star Trek, which David shows, illustrating this point that we can imagine, and indeed often do in fiction, the idea of two people swapping bodies. Did I put this one in twice? Yeah, apologies. I put the near-death one in twice here. The body swap thought experiment is sort of similar to the disembodied thought experiment, except in the first case, it's saying that you can exist without any body, any physical substrate at all. In the second case, it's saying that you could have a different body and still have the same mental state, or still be the same person, right? So slightly different, but similar sort of thought experiment there. The third one here relates to the coherence of idealism and out-of-body experiences. So, I mean, this out-of-body experience is pretty similar to a disembodied experience. Idealism is the idea that all that exists is ideas, everything is mental, and there's sort of no physical reality. The idea here is that that's, again, conceivable, even if you don't think it's true. You can kind of imagine that. You could imagine that you're like deceived by a demon or something, and there's really no physical reality. It's all just some kind of hallucination in your mind or in God's mind, or some shared hallucination. Again, you might not think it's true, but it's conceivable, right? So again, we're getting a bunch of conceivable arguments here. That's the point here. Now, the fourth argument here, I think, is an odd one. David talks about indirect realism, or the sense datum theory of perception. He has quite a long discussion about this. But I don't actually think I talk about it here because I don't really think it's very relevant. Oh yeah, so here's what I say about this. So this is a quote, again, from David in the video. The skeptic of the modal argument has to adopt direct realism as a theory of perception, as any knowledge we have of material objects is mediated by means of sensory perception. So direct realism is a theory of perception, like how we experience the world and how we come to have a knowledge of things outside of ourselves. Direct realism is the mainstream position, especially among physicalists. It essentially says that in some sense we have a direct interaction with, or direct awareness of, the physical world outside of us. So when you see a tree, you in some sense are directly aware of the tree. This is a bit of a complex issue because there's different versions of direct realism, which David doesn't actually talk about in the video. There's like a representational version, which I'm partial to, and there's like a a more basic version, but we're not going to get into that here. It's too complicated and out of field. But the point is, David is saying, and I just wanted to emphasize this because he does make he talks quite a lot at length about it in the video, so I didn't think I should ignore it completely. He is saying that if you're a skeptic of the modal argument, you have to adopt direct realism as a theory of perception. And the reason for this is because if you adopt a different view, indirect realism or the sense datum theory, which is an older view, that means that kind of by definition in that view, we only have indirect access to the world outside of us, which means that according to the indirect realism view, our sensory perceptions could be exactly the same, even if there were no physical objects. And so according to indirect realism, it just sort of follows that it would be possible for us to exist in the absence of anything physical. It's sort of like a version of idealism, but it's of the possibility of idealism, but it's applying through or argued through the idea that your theory of sensory perception is going to affect what modal claims you endorse. So if you're an indirect realist, you kind of necessarily endorse this claim that it's at least possible that there could be no physical objects. A direct realist actually doesn't say that. They'll have to deny that. If a direct realist says that if we have a perception of a tree, that means there is a tree. It's complicated because obviously there are hallucinations and there's fictional objects. So there's ways of dealing with that. But all I want to say here is that David says that the skeptic of the modal argument can't be an indirect realist, but he then goes on to say that indirect realism is overwhelmingly favored. Like he gives a whole bunch of arguments for it. I think they're all very unconvincing, but I don't want to get too sidetracked. So at this point, I'll just say, if you think direct realism and any of its variants fails, then you might be more willing to acknowledge that conceivability implies possibility, or that it's possible that there could be no physical world. But I'm going to say here that I don't agree that indirect realism is very plausible. And in fact, it's a very fringe position these days because it has a lot of sort of implausible commitments. But I'm just going to move on from that because it's a bit of a sidetrack. And he goes into this for about half an hour, I think, which is not something I want to get into here. Okay, so putting that last issue aside, we have seen three main defenses of this conceivability, of the possibility premise here, right? The possibility premise is saying it's possible that minds could exist without a physical substrate. And mainly that's based on these conceivability arguments that we could exist without a body, or we could exist in a different body, or idealism could be true, right? So these conceivability points. So as I said, there's two ways to reject this premise here. You can either deny that these are conceivable, or you can agree that they're conceivable, but deny that that means they're possible. So one way to do this is to adopt a position called modal skepticism. So this is a view of being skeptic about modal knowledge, philosophical position that modal knowledge is difficult to come by, maybe even impossible, that would be a very strong claim. So a moderate modal skepticism would say that we can only have a limited knowledge of modal beliefs in a limited range. So I think it's implausible to say that we have no modal knowledge, right? Because this would be to say, look, if I'm standing on a busy street and I think, well, what would happen if I just darted across the street now? I'd probably get hit and run over. I'm not going to do that, right? So because I don't do that, it doesn't actually happen. It's a counterfactual. It's possible. So that's modal knowledge, right? Whenever you reason about something that didn't happen or won't happen or hasn't happened, that's modal knowledge. So plausibly, we have to have at least some modal knowledge, or at least I would argue. And the physicalists can easily explain how we get that. It doesn't have to be anything, anything particularly out of the ordinary, right? There's various ways of obtaining modal knowledge. But the question is, what are the limits of our modal knowledge? How much modal knowledge do you think we could have? I think we can have modal knowledge of that sort, like imagining if we would run across the street, what would happen? But that's a fairly modest claim. The question is, what are the limits of that type of knowledge? So here's Peter van Inwagen here. He thinks we can have modal knowledge, but he says he's not really sure how we can come to that modal knowledge. How do we know the simple, obvious modal statements to be true? What is the ground of this basic modal knowledge? He says that he doesn't know how to answer these questions, which, I mean, van Inwagen has some views which are contentious, but I would say that that's actually not that difficult for a physicalist to answer. So, oh yeah, I think that's all I have on that. So, sorry, getting a bit hoarse here. If only my throat was immaterial, I could go through this more quickly. So I think it's pretty easy to explain how we can come to have modal knowledge, at least about some things. And the theory that I would put forward is called a combinatorial theory of modality. Basically, this means that we have modal knowledge by taking knowledge we have of pieces, bits of reality, aspects, situations, and then recombining them in different ways. Like in the simple case of running across the road, like we know how running works, we know what's going to happen when we run across the road, we know how cars work, we know what happens when a car hits something at speed, right? We haven't maybe even seen that scenario ourselves, but we know enough about the components, the component pieces to simulate that effectively, mentally simulate that, or reason by analogy from similar things that we've seen. So this is a combinatorial view that we obtain modal knowledge by putting together pieces of other things that we have seen but in different combinations, maybe slightly different, maybe substantially different. Obviously, that theory is going to have limitations because you can't just combine things arbitrarily and expect to know what will happen. So there's going to be a range of things that we can know based on proximity to things that actually do happen. I mean, we have knowledge of what happens when you run across roads, right? But you can apply that knowledge in slightly different cases because you never have knowledge of exactly what would happen if, like, exactly you at exactly this time ran across exactly this road and exactly these cars were present, because that's never happened before. We reason by analogy with similar cases, similar cars, similar roads, and so forth, similar speeds. The question is, how far can you go? How far can you extrapolate this? And at some point, according to this view, our modal intuitions or our modal reasoning is going to break down. It's going to become unreliable. And that's just going to depend on the specific domain, right? It's going to be context specific. I don't think you can give a general answer to when modal knowledge is reliable and when it isn't. You're going to have to look at the particulars. So, I mean, that's what I would say in answer to that question. I don't think that there's anything too difficult there. So the point I would say here is that the substance dualist is going to say that, look, you're being too skeptical about modal knowledge. If you say that we can't know that the mind could at least possibly exist without a brain because of modal skepticism, you're just being too skeptical. But I think the easy response here is just to say, well, look, here's how we can have some modal knowledge, but that doesn't license you to have that particular type of modal knowledge. So, and here's a sort of, here's someone who's essentially getting at that response here. They're saying the reason we feel the tug of contingency pulling consciousness loose from its physical moorings. So effectively, this is saying, here's why we can imagine having minds without any bodies. It's why it feels contingent, why it feels like it's possible for them to come apart. The reason we feel the tug of contingency may be that we do not and cannot grasp the nature of the property that intelligibly links them. The brain has physical properties we cannot grasp, and its variations in these correlate with changes in consciousness, but we cannot draw the veil that conceals the manner of their connection. So essentially he's saying, well, look, we're ignorant of all of the details of the brain and how it works and how it relates to the mind, how it gives rise to the mind. And therefore it feels like we can separate them mentally. It feels like we can tease them apart and imagine one without the other. But that doesn't mean that it really is, that it really is possible to tease them apart. It's just that we lack sufficient knowledge to understand that. So he's saying here, there may be a real necessary connection, but it will just always seem brute or unperspicuous to us. Like we don't see that necessary connection because of our lack of knowledge. He says here, as upholders of intrinsic contingency, we may be dupes of our own cognitive blindness. So what he's saying there, again, is that there may be a necessary connection between mental states and physical states, just like what the physicalist says, but we might not realize that because of our limitations, our cognitive limitations and our limitations of what we know about the brain and its properties, right? So that's not saying we can't have any modal knowledge. It's just saying we can't have this particular type of modal knowledge because our knowledge about these areas is not sufficiently developed. I think that's a very reasonable position. Now, what's the response to that from the dualists? Well, here's one. They say, isn't the simplest explanation of why we feel this tug of contingency, obviously that's appealing to this quote here, and even feel that there is a deep contingency between person and body, that the relation truly is contingent? The ground for thinking that a relation is contingent is typically the conceivability of the relation failing to hold. So I think this is a very bad response. It's basically saying, look, why do we feel that it's contingent? Well, he's saying, well, because it is. But he hasn't addressed the actual argument here. The argument here is that we feel that it's contingent because we don't have adequate understanding of the nature of the connection. We're cognitively limited. And he's just kind of saying, but why should we think the response is essentially to say, but why do we feel that type of contingency? It must be because it's real. Like, he just hasn't addressed the underlying point there. The reason we feel the type of contingency is because we can't see the connection because we're cognitively limited. That's just completely gone by him because he doesn't refer to that at all. He's just like, isn't the best explanation because it's true? Well, no, the best explanation isn't because it's true. The best explanation is because we don't see the connection, because we don't know enough. Like, I don't understand how you can say that you can explain this feeling of contingency based on the fact that it is contingent. That is, how can you explain our perception of something, our knowledge of something, because of it, just by it being the fact? I didn't explain it very well. How can we explain the fact that we feel a certain way just because that thing is true? That's like saying the reason that I see a tree is because there is a tree. Now you might think, well, what's unreasonable about that? Remember, in order for me to see a tree, there has to be more than just be a tree there. I also have to be in a position to see it. Right? If there's a wall between me and the tree, then you can't just say the reason I see a tree is because there's a tree there, because I can't see the tree. There's a wall in the way. In order for it to be the case that I can know something to be true, I have to have access to that thing through some method, right, of perception or intellect or whatever. Now, here, this guy is saying that we can explain why people think there's a contingent connection between mind and brain is simply because it is a contingent connection. It's not, there's no necessary connection there. We can have minds without brains, but that just doesn't answer the question. The fact that something is true doesn't automatically mean that people know that it's true. You have to give some account as to how they got to that knowledge, right? And he just completely ignores that. This was the point being made here by Colin McGinn, right? We don't have that knowledge, and so we think it's contingent, that there's no necessary connection, even though there is. And he's just saying, but maybe there isn't a connection. Like, it just doesn't address the point at all. I propose the reason why we do not grasp a necessary tie is because it is not there. But why is that a better explanation than saying because we don't understand it? Right? It seems sort of clearer to me that we do have a deep limitations of our knowledge, particularly about the brain and how it works, and many things about it are not perspicuous to us. And to just leap from, oh, we must know everything, and therefore, if we can't see a connection, it's not there, just seems to be totally unwarranted to me. Like, I don't understand how he just ignores the entire point of our limitations of that type of knowledge. It's a woefully inadequate response, I think. Okay, so that was this sort of modal skepticism response to say that, look, we just can't really have that type of modal knowledge. And the response to it, I think, was wholly inadequate. It's just to say, well, but we do, though, somehow, without explanation. Now, here's a different response. And this is what I was saying before. You can deny that something is conceivable, or you can deny that, and that's the modal skepticism response. It's denying that something is conceivable, effectively. Like, we don't know whether it's conceivable. Now here it's saying, look, it might be conceivable that we could have a mind without a body or without any physical substrate, but that doesn't mean that it's possible. So this is the conceivability possibility response. It's to snip this connection between conceivability and possibility. There's various ways to do that. One way to do that is to present counterexamples. So here the example is given of Goldbach's conjecture, right? It's just a conjecture about prime numbers, or sums of prime numbers. It seems that we can imagine it being proved and we can imagine it being disproved, but it's necessarily true or false, right? So like it can't be both ways. So it's not possible for Goldbach's conjecture to be true and let me say that a different way. Logically, it's possible that it's only logically possible for Goldbach's conjecture to be true, or logically possible for it to be false. One is logically impossible, and yet we can conceive of both. So we can conceive of both, but only one is logically possible. That seems to indicate that there's a gap between conceivability and possibility. That's the argument, right? Now, the dualists object to this. Well, what do they have to say about this? Essentially, what they're going to say is that when they say conceivable, when they say, look, we can imagine these things, they don't necessarily mean that you can imagine it or I can imagine it. What they mean is that a hypothetical person with an idealized knowledge of the situation could conceive of it. We might have this is what's essentially being said here. We might have an imperfect knowledge of it. And so with that imperfect knowledge, we might imagine certain things of it. Here he says we might visualize headlines of it being proved, mathematicians saying that it's proved, but we can't actually conceive of the proof, right? I mean, if we could conceive of the proof, then we could give the proof, right? And so I think this is what he's saying here. We don't actually have the knowledge or the capacity to actually conceive of it being proved or disproved. We can only conceive of like superficial related things to it being proved. And that's because we have limited capabilities, right? So it's not clear that this is a counterexample because you can't actually conceive of this, right? You can only conceive of superficial related things like people saying that it's proved or headlines, but not the actual proof itself. It's not a clear and conceivable positive counterexample. We'll come back to this point, but I think, okay, if that's the criteria that like you have to be able to be ideally conceiving of it with a positive conception of having all of like the relevant factors filled out. Okay, maybe you can't conceive of the truth and falsity of Goldbach's conjecture, but again, we'll come back to this point as to how relevant that is. Now, here's another potential counterexample: water and H2O. At least according to some people, like Hilary Putnam, we can conceive of water not being H2O, water being something else, like XYZ is the classic example that's given. If water is some other chemical substance. But according to many philosophers, it's logically impossible that water is anything other than H2O. And therefore conceivability is no guide of possibility. So this is a claim that originates from a position called semantic externalism. It's a little bit on here because David doesn't actually talk about this in this part of the video, but he talks about it later on. So he says here, this is a modal claim in need of justification, which requires a skeptic to defend the modal claim. And it begs the question, well, the reason for saying that water is it's not logically possible for water to not be H2O, or it's logically necessary that water is H2O, is because of this position called semantic externalism, which essentially says that the referent or the meaning or reference of a word is determined by the factors or facts in the world that govern the use of that term. So in other words, when we talk about water, the stuff that we're talking about is H2O, like that's what governs that, the stuff that it's referring to, that it's about in the external world. According to semantic externalism, that is the meaning of the word water. It is actually H2O, like the referent of it, its reference is H2O. And again, the idea is that actually establishes that there is a logical identity between the two. Imagine, essentially, what the semantic externalist is saying is that we have this statement here, water equals H2O, but that water there is kind of like a variable, which then when you realize the value, it's actually H2O. Right. And so then we have a statement, H2O is H2O, which is logically necessary, right? Like that's a tautology. That's a crude characterization, but that's essentially what the semantic externalist is saying. Water refers to H2O and that determines its meaning. And so therefore water is necessarily H2O. It's logically impossible for it to be anything else. It's conceivable that it could be something else, but it's not actually possible. So this is sometimes what's called an a posteriori logical necessity. So it's a necessary claim that is only knowable a posteriori. Now, I'm not telling you whether to agree with that or not. This is a pretty standard position these days. I tend to disagree with it myself. I'm more of a semantic internalist. That's not really the point here, though. David doesn't really seem to understand that that's the basis of making this claim, which is odd because later on he does talk about this in a few hours later. Although originally this 9-hour video was stitched together from individual parts. So I don't know whether he only came across semantic externalism when he did like the later part of the video, because it seems that he should have talked about it here. But he just sort of says, well, this isn't defended. But like the defense is very standard. It's semantic externalism. That's why this is being stated as a counterexample. And the response that Timothy McGrew gives here to this counterexample is essentially just to say that externalism is wrong. He says here, to have a means of identifying water prior to chemical investigation, we use a description such as the clear, odorless, potable fluid that makes my plants thrive. So that's what we call a definite description. That's describing the properties of something. That is a different way of explicating the meaning of a word. So if you think that the meaning of a word is given by a definite description, that's actually called a semantic internalist view. And that's exactly what someone like Putnam is going to reject. He says, no, the meaning of the word water isn't given by a definite description like this. It's given by the thing that it refers to. So it's sort of unclear what this objection is supposed to do. It's really going to come down to what you think about the nature of semantic externalism as to whether this is whether this H2O water example, or there's other examples you can give, like this is just one that's typically used, whether that is a counterexample to the conceivability possibility argument, that you can go from conceivability to possibility. And I think that that's just not engaged with here. it doesn't seem like David even understands that that's why that's being appealed to. Here's another counterexample, which is similar. It's really the same point made in a slightly different way. So Hesperus and Phosphorus, right? This is just the morning and the evening star. I forget which one is which, I'm afraid. I don't remember if Hesperus is the morning or the evening. But anyway. So again, the argument here is, look, the ancients, at least at some point, they saw a star in the evening, they saw a star in the morning. They didn't know if they were the same star or not. So they could imagine them being different stars or different planets. I mean, they didn't necessarily know. So it's conceivable that they're different, but in fact, they refer to the same thing. And again, depending on your views of language, you might think that it's essential that these both refer to Venus because that's their referent, right? And therefore, it's conceivable that they're different, but not possible that they're different. So it's another counterexample to this conceivability implying possibility. So at this point, we seem to have a number of counterexamples to the idea of conceivability implying possibility. There's the H2O and XYZ one. Oh, sorry, the water and H2O example. There's Hesperus and Phosphorus. Then there's this sort of general idea of modal skepticism that maybe we just don't have that type of modal knowledge about whether something is even possible, or whether something that we can conceive of, if we only conceive of it dimly, implies that something is possible. Remember, there was the Goldbach conjecture example. The counter to that was, well, we can't really conceive of that properly. We can only conceive of it like people saying that it was proved. We couldn't actually conceive of the proof. So what we're going to need to do here is think a bit more carefully about what conceivability actually means and what the criteria are for that, in order to decide whether conceivability implies possibility in a way that will allow this modal argument to go through. So here's our old friend David Lund talking about this. So the idea is that in order for something to be conceivable in a way that implies possibility, it needs to be distinct. So here he's talking about distinctness. Distinctnness requires a conception which is seen with clarity, is intelligibly seen as possessing all its whatness specifying properties. I think that just means essential properties. All those needed to constitute what it is to be that item. So essential properties, just the things that make it what it is. So distinctness is to be achieved if the clearly conceived individual or situation can be seen as self-contained without implicit incoherence or inconsistency. This is a bit waffly, but I think he's saying that to conceive of something distinctly, you need to be able to sort of clearly and vividly identify the essential properties of that thing and see that there is no implicit incoherence. So you need to be able to understand it thoroughly enough to detect any possible hidden inconsistency or incoherence. So this is trying to essentially say that conceivability isn't just like kind of thinking about something or imagining it vaguely. Like it requires fairly distinct and careful thinking through in detail and vividly of what it is exactly you're imagining. So the point is that this allows you to rule out deep or unobvious incoherence, because obviously you might imagine something and not realize there's an incoherence there. That might be imagining that you've proved the Goldbach conjecture, but you've missed an incoherence or inconsistency somewhere. The idea is, no, you have to distinctly and vividly conceive of that something. So that's important, right? So when we're going to say it's conceivable that the mind can exist without a material substrate, or that minds can swap bodies, we're not just going to say it's sort of conceivable vaguely. We're going to say, no, it's distinctly conceivable. So this is an important point. Here's another distinction here, which is related but a bit different. Positively conceivable versus negatively conceivable. So a positive conceivability means that we have a distinctly and concretely, maybe that's not the best word, but an imagined scenario with the detail present, right? Negative conceivability means that we just haven't seen a contradiction. So negative conceivability is a weaker condition, because it means sort of we imagine things and we don't see any problem. Whereas positive conceivability, we've like worked through all of the details, so to speak. So that's a much stronger condition. The idea here is that positive conceivability is going to be the stronger guide to is possibility than negative conceivability. So David Pallmann has talked about this. He's a really big component of this, the modal argument, although he has a different name for it, to his version of it, but it's essentially the modal argument. And so he's argued at length about the idea that conceivability entails possibility. So Chalmers says that he has this distinction between something that's primarily conceivable and something that is secondarily conceivable. And here he's defining primary conceivability. Oh yeah, sorry. Here's where he defines secondary conceivable. I should have highlighted these points. He identifies, I'm just seeing what I say about this. Yeah, so he distinguishes between the idea of imagining something is actually the case, that's primarily conceivable, and imagining that it was possibly could have been the case. So is the case versus could have been the case. Those are quite distinct, right? And so primary conceivability refers to what's epistemically possible, whereas secondary conceivability refers to what is counterfactually possible. So what is the case for all I know, which is the primary one, versus what could have been the case. So one's a claim about epistemic possibility, essentially, and one is a claim about counterfactual possibility. So this is important for his version of the modal argument. And the point here is, I mean, there's more details to that, which actually David doesn't go into, which is interesting, but in the in the main video. But the point here is that there are different forms of conceivability, and it's important to distinguish those, which exactly we're talking about for understanding the modal argument. Yeah, and I think that David doesn't very clearly, just trying to see, yeah, he doesn't really clearly draw this together very well, I think. But the key point there is that he claims that the thought experiments that he's come up with, like the existing without a body and swapping bodies and idealism, those sorts of things, are conceivable in quite a strong way. So positively conceivable in a way that you can like detect the hidden incoherencies and things like that. David Chalmers also talks about the idea of something being ideally conceivable. He doesn't actually mention that here, but he talks about that in his writing as well. I mentioned this before. Ideal conceivability means not just that you can conceive of it. It means that an ideal agent who had like all the relevant knowledge and had thought about it really carefully, they could conceive of it. And that is, the idea is that ideal, positive, distinct conceivability is what gives you, is what is a good guide to possibility. So if some ideal agent with all the relevant knowledge who'd thought about it really carefully can vividly conceive of a positively like articulated scenario, then that scenario is possible. So that's essentially what the argument is. I'll come back to that. And this point here, I'm just, like I say, we're nearly at the end of this. So this point here, I think fundamentally undermines the modal argument here, because basically in order to get the modal argument to work, let me just jump back here to the argument as a whole to make sure we're on the same page. Here's the argument, right? We're looking at, sorry, that was premise 3. Too many damn slides here. So here's the argument as a whole. We're looking at premise 3 here. It is logically possible for my mind to exist apart from anything material. How do we get to that? We go there through conceivability. So first we say it's conceivable for the mind to exist without any material. From conceivability, we say it's possible that it could exist without anything material. And if it's possible, then the mind can't be essentially material. And therefore it's not material, right? So that's how the argument goes. Now we talked about the essentially material part. Here we're just looking at the logically possible part. In order to go from the step that it's something's conceivable to therefore it's possible, what we've seen here is that the substance dualists, and even others like David Chalmers, he's not a substance dualist, they have to really add a lot of detail and add a lot of extra structure to what conceivability is. It's this idea, it's not whether you can sort of vaguely think about it. It's whether you can clearly and vividly have a positive conception of something and work through all of the possible, like clearly think through all of the possible hidden incoherencies, right? And furthermore, not even whether you can do that, but whether an ideal agent can do that, who has like all of the relevant knowledge and can think through things sufficiently clearly. So that's ideal conceivability. And the problem is that, and this is really never addressed in this video, the dualists just don't have an argument that any of these things that they talk about are ideally, positively, distinctly conceivable. All they can say is that it seems to us like they are. But there's no real argument that an ideal agent would be able to conceive of these things. Again, the physicalist, as I said before, is going to say that the reason they seem conceivable to us is because we don't have the proper knowledge. It seems like that there's this possibility of disconnecting the mind from anything physical, but that's just an illusion because we don't understand the nature of the physicality well enough. And it seems like in order to get around that, the physicalists are going to say, well, yeah, but it needs to be ideally conceivable. And it is ideally conceivable, but they don't have an argument to why it's ideally conceivable because we don't know what's ideally conceivable. That's just pure hypothetical gesturing at, well, an idealized being would have access to this. But there's no real argument for this. Again, the claim is not simply that there are these thought experiments that establish that the mind could be something outside of the brain, or could exist outside of the brain. The dualists are actually saying something much stronger than that. They're saying not just that we can conceive of it, that we can conceive of it of this scenario, but they're saying that we could conceive of this scenario in full positive detail, even if we had much more information than we actually do. So that's like hypothetical conceivability, because no one can actually do that, right? This was the issue with this response here from Timothy McGrew. Sorry, not that response. This response here. He's saying in response to this objection here about the gold bucket objection, well, you haven't really conceived of it properly. You haven't conceived of it in proper detail. But it seems that this is coming back to bite the dualist in the bottom at this point, because they haven't conceived of the existence of the mind without the brain in this detail either. All they've done is they've thought of the idea of swapping bodies, or thought of the idea of mind existing without a body, insofar as their limited mind can conceive of it, but they haven't conceived of it in the full, vivid, positive detail that would be necessary. And in particular, as I argued before, really all this amounts to is imagining vague things like having a different body but being the same person. But like, that's not really very specific, is it? You haven't actually imagined the full neurophysiological detail of what it would mean to have a different body but the same mind, or to have a mind but without a body. And there's no way that any person can do that, right? Not any actual person. So really what they have is not even thought experiments, but it's like hypothetical thought experiments, which they're arguing, well, we think that an idealized person who had access to the relevant knowledge would have these intuitions, but they can't actually show that they would, because no one has epistemic access to that sort of information. So I find that this whole modal argument incredibly weak. In order to justify the key link here between conceivability and modality, they have to beef up conceivability so much and add so many qualifiers to it. It becomes impossible for anyone to actually have that strength of conceivability. And when you raise that, they just say, oh, you're being too much of a modal skeptic. We saw that response before. But that's not a fair response, because the naturalist can give, I think, fairly clear arguments as to when we can have modal knowledge and when we can't, when we don't have modal knowledge. And we can have modal knowledge in cases where we can reason from inferences about systems that we know work in a certain way. We can put the ingredients together in slightly different ways and make extrapolations. But that's not really going to work in cases that involve huge departures from anything that we actually observe, like minds existing without brains or swapping of bodies. Like those things don't actually happen. Or idealism being true. I mean, I suppose if that does happen, there's no way we can know, right? So the point is that there's no way that we can modally reason about those in the same way that we modally reason about other things. So to put everything together, all the naturalist has to say to respond to the modal argument is, yes, we can have some modal knowledge, and here's how we can have it, but we can't have unlimited modal knowledge. The type of modal knowledge you're saying that we can have would require, in order to go from this conceivability to possibility, would require beefing up the type of conceptions of the strength of the conceivability of out-of-body experiences and things like that. It would require strengthening that so much. No actual person has that level of conceivability. And so you're just guessing about what this idealized observer would be able to conceive of. In actual fact, we have so little ability to fully grasp and imagine all of the details of someone existing, like a mind existing without a body, like how that mind could exist in the absence of a body. All you're really doing is imagining a mind and not imagining a body. That's not a full positive description, right? Or imagining a body swap or things like that. You're not fully imagining it. You're just imagining bits of it and failing to imagine other bits of it. Or you're only imagining it loosely. So I think that they can't meet the strong burden that they put on themselves in order to establish that conceivability implies possibility. So Whether you reject conceivability or whether you reject the modal inference from conceivability to possibility, I think depends on how strongly you understand conceivability, how strong it has to be. But I think either way, there's ample room here for the materialist to object to one or both of those aspects. So I think the modal argument is not very convincing there. All right, just pausing quickly here before we get to our final argument. So we've looked at, just having a bit of a look at chat here. Yeah, I know there's a bit of a lot in this video, but that's okay. That's the nature of these things. I think because it is getting a bit late, what I'll do is go through this last argument here, and then I'll cover the objections to substance dualism and responses in a second video. That will probably take longer anyway. So we've covered the argument from the nature of the self, mostly like the unity of the self. We've covered the argument from introspection. We've covered the conceivability argument. Lastly, we're going to talk about the knowledge argument, which actually may be the best known argument for dualism. Question mark. I'm not entirely sure about that, but it seems that it's often discussed. So for those who've heard of this, this is Mary, the colorblind neuroscientist here. So this is another thought experiment. You may see some things in common there about previous arguments. So Mary is a neuroscientist who knows everything there is to know about color vision and how it all works neurophysiologically and the physics of light and all of that sort of thing. But there's different versions. She's colorblind, or she lives in a black and white room or whatever. She's never actually seen color herself. She's never had a color experience. The idea is she's in a room where she's had that experience her whole life. She's only ever seen black and white. One day she goes outside. The idea is, the intuition here is, when she goes outside, she learns something new. She learns what it is like to see red or blue or whatever, right? So previously, she knew all of the facts that there was to know, all of the physical information about color and vision and all that, but yet she still learned something new when she went outside and saw color for the first time. Therefore, there must be something to color that is not embodied in the physical. There's more to it than the physical world. So physicalism is false. Another way to say this, physical information is not sufficient to deduce truths that characterize conscious experience, or like what it is like to see a color or have other experiences. You need something beyond just the physical information, the physical facts. Now, a clarification here. The issue is not whether it's psychologically possible to know all the physical truths. Maybe they don't fit in anyone's head, right? We don't have the requisite understanding. So they're not saying that it's like psychologically possible. The idea is that it's a logical point here. Even if hypothetically you could know all of those things, it would not be sufficient to deduce what it would be like to experience color. You'd actually have to go outside and have that experience. And the idea is that shows that there's something beyond the physical facts of the matter that determines the nature of phenomenal truths. So here's the presentation of the argument. Complete possession of all knowledge of physical truths is not sufficient to give propositional knowledge. Is not positioned. Let me start again here. Complete possession of all knowledge of all physical truths is not sufficient to provide all knowledge of the actual world. If that's true, then physicalism is false. But complete possession of all knowledge of physical truth is not sufficient to provide all knowledge of the actual world. Therefore, physicalism is false. So there's two claims here, right? A conditional and then affirming the antecedent here. So again, the physicalist can deny either of these claims here. Now, let's have a look at each of these, why you would believe each of these. First of all, premise one. I personally find this is a confusing way of formulating the argument, to be honest, but this is the one that he's given here, so we'll work with that. So why would you think that if knowledge of all physical truth is not enough to know everything, then physicalism is false? Well, the argument that's given here is that physicalism says that all there is to the world is like physical stuff interacting with each other, bits of matter doing things, right? There's nothing over and above that. That's all there is. So likewise, physicalism about the mind specifically says that like being in pain or seeing red or whatever it is nothing else apart from some kind of functional state. This is at least a better characterization than like the bit of the brain thing we talked about before. Being in pain is a functional state that realizes the role of being in pain. So like there's some physical state that instantiates as that, right? So he's saying here that if that's true, it means that knowing all of these fundamental facts should be enough for knowing everything else. So he's saying that physicalism says that there's nothing above all of the physical facts. There's just the physical facts. And so the idea is, look, if you know all those physical facts, then you should know everything. Like there's nothing more to know. So, like being in pain. Like if you know all of the components that go into being in pain, then you just should know about pain, right? There's nothing else to it. That's essentially the argument here. So that's why it's saying if physical knowledge is not sufficient, then physicalism is false. But is physical knowledge sufficient? Well, this is where Mary's thought experiment comes in. It seems at the very least, she's gained knowledge about phenomenal properties, like knowing that redness is exemplified, for example. There is something that is red that looks like this, right? There's some question here about whether this is propositional knowledge. I think plausibly, like you could argue about whether knowledge of phenomenal states is propositional. The argument here is at least it's partly propositional. So, for example, he says here, Mary comes to know that sensations of red are more like sensations of green than they are sensations of sourness. So that there's at least some propositional knowledge here. Likewise, that redness is exemplified. That's another piece of propositional knowledge. Propositional knowledge is knowledge that you can assert in like a that clause, that something is the case. Not all knowledge is propositional. So like how to ride a bike, that's not propositional knowledge. So some people have said that recognizing phenomenal properties might be more like some sort of ability rather than propositional knowledge. That is something that's discussed in the video. I'm not going to go down that road here because I'm not convinced that that response is sufficient. I think that plausibly there are at least some types of knowledge about phenomenal states that are propositional. So the idea here is that if there are some propositional knowledge about phenomenal states, the idea is that if you believe in the Mary thought experiment, then Mary goes outside, she learns some new propositional knowledge. So that's the justification of 2. It's basically the Mary thought experiment. The justification of 1 is what we looked at before. It seems like if there's nothing to the physical world other than these bits of matter and functional states that they realize, then knowing those facts should mean that you know everything, right? So that's the justification of the 2 premises there. Now, I'll just go over that. I already talked about this. Now, the most common physicalist objection to the knowledge argument is called the phenomenal concept strategy, or the new knowledge, old fact view. So this amounts to rejecting this first premise here. So, and this is going to be the response that I'm going to defend here. The complete possession of all knowledge of physical truths, according to this view, is not sufficient to give all propositional knowledge of the actual world. Well, how does that work? Well, so David does talk about this in the video, but he doesn't explain it very well. So I've pulled this from the Stanford Encyclopedia to try to give a general sense of this. I'm going to go through all the details here because it's a little complicated. But basically, the idea here is that this is the phenomenal concept response that the physicalists can give to respond to the Mary thought experiment. You can just deny that Mary does learn anything. I personally think that that's not the most plausible, but we can talk about that a little later. But here's how you can respond to the first premise of the argument. So you accept the thought experiment, but interpret it differently. So the idea here is that phenomenal character, so like what it is like to see blue or red or something, is a physical property of certain experiences, certain brain states. But in order to obtain knowledge of those physical, of those phenomenal concepts, you have to undergo a certain type of experience. So to gain knowledge of what it's like to have an experience of a certain phenomenal character requires acquiring this type of concept. So a certain type of knowledge, a knowledge of experiential nature, requires a certain type of concept, like a mental representation of what something is, right? Phenomenal concepts. It's a special type of knowledge. The further claim, which I've highlighted here, is that the only way that you can acquire phenomenal concepts is to have had or be having a certain type of experiences. So to be in a certain state. So the idea here is that Mary can have knowledge of all sorts of physical facts, but what she lacks is a phenomenal concept. The phenomenal concept refers to a certain physical state. It's the physical, like it's the brain state that gives rise to, or well, really that is identical to that phenomenal state. But a phenomenal concept is a way of viewing that physical state. It's a way of viewing it essentially from the inside. It's like what that brain state feels like from the inside, so to speak. That's a crude way of putting it. But the idea is you can only acquire that phenomenal concept by having that experience, by being in that physical state. And that's why Mary can't gain it just by in her room, like reading stuff. You have to have actually had the experience to gain that phenomenal concept. I thought I had another slide here. Sorry. So this is the essential nature of the phenomenal concept strategy. It's a bit abstract, but the basic idea is that it sort of relates to the morning and the evening star idea. The morning star and the evening star, there's two different ways of viewing something that is actually the same thing. It's just Venus, right? But you didn't necessarily know it's Venus. In order to know that, you have to have sort of seen it both ways, to see it through the morning star and see it through the evening star, and then also have the additional knowledge that they're the same thing. The idea here is that Mary could have a third-person knowledge of brain states and the functions that they have, right, and how they relate to each other. But what she wouldn't have is this phenomenal concept that allows her to see those brain states, so to speak, from the inside, like to experience them effectively. The phenomenal concept refers to the same brain state. So this is why it's called the old fact view. There's no new fact. There's no facts outside of just physical facts about brain states, but there's different ways of viewing, of looking at, or of thinking about, or representing would be a more cognitive way of putting it. There's different ways of representing that same fact. You can represent it from kind of like a third person point of view, which is like maybe a scientific point of view, or you can represent it from a first person point of view, which is what it's like to experience that thing. There's no new fact of the matter because they both refer to the same brain state. But you can have the phenomenal experience, you can have the phenomenal concept without knowing anything about the physical state that Insantea is at, or the vice versa, which is the Mary state. She knows all about the physical state, but she doesn't have the phenomenal concept yet until she goes outside. So it's two ways of viewing the same thing, but the phenomenal concept way is sort of viewed from the inside, is gained by being that physical system effectively. I was going to talk about different conceptions of the phenomenal concept strategy because there's many different ways of like giving the detail of this. I'm quite partial to Ty here, who talks about the phenomenal state as a special type of representation of the way something is, and that you can't fully understand it without having had that experience. So the claim here is that phenomenal states are physical states, but you can't fully understand them until you think about them through the lens of the phenomenal concept. Phenomenal concept is like a lens of viewing a physical state, but you can't see it through that lens unless you actually have that experience. There's nothing really mystical about this. All this is really saying is there's different ways of looking at the world, and looking at the world in one way won't necessarily mean that you can look at it in another way. And yet those two different views may be converging to seeing the same thing, but seeing it in different ways. The idea is a phenomenal concept is like the inside way of looking at a brain state. It's what it feels like to be the brain state when you are the brain state, right? You don't get that by just looking at it from a third person point of view and reading a bunch of like scientific papers and things like that. Now, there are a variety of responses to this. One response that's given here is essentially a common one, just to say, look, that's fine. You can talk about these phenomenal concepts, but you need to give an account as to like how they're supposed to work, how a purely physical account of what it is to acquire and deploy a phenomenal concept. Well, I've sort of done that here. Like, again, David doesn't really talk about this, but there are actually lots of accounts that are given. There's one from Ty here and also one from Papineau. There are others as well on the Stanford Encyclopedia. If you're interested in this, it's very extensively discussed in the literature. So I think that there are a lot of plausible accounts that can be given. Also, I'll note here that this is a very inconsistent argument to give, because later, and as I said, I'll split this into a separate video when we look at objections to dualism. Later, David says repeatedly that you can know something is the case without knowing how it's the case. And it seems to me that the physicalists could also say this: look, we may not have a full understanding of how phenomenal concepts work, but we may know that they are the case. David deploys that in defense of substance dualism a number of times, and I think it's inconsistent in here to demand the physicalists give a fully worked out account, even though I think the physicalists can give plausible accounts of this. Now, this statement here effectively is, so this is what I find a bit confusing, because in this section of the video, David now talks about semantic externalism, because this is a way of understanding the phenomenal concept strategy, right? It's effectively looking at the same thing through two different lenses or under different concepts. they refer to the same thing, but there's like different ways of looking at it. Now, this is odd because it seems that semantic externalism is more relevant to the modal argument. It's directly relevant to this idea of going from conceivability to possibility. I don't actually think it's relevant to the knowledge argument, because you don't need to be a semantic externalist to believe that you can have two different ways of referring to the same thing. The semantic externalism is a stronger argument about rigid designators and other things. I mean, you can use that as an argument in favor of phenomenal concepts if you want, but I don't think there's any necessary connection there. And I don't really understand why David goes into this long. You see, I've skipped a lot here because he goes on to critique semantic externalism, but I don't think that that's really relevant here. You don't need to defend semantic externalism to defend phenomenal concepts. I don't know why David thinks that you do. So I think that part would have been better put in the modal section where I think it is relevant. So I think that that's a bit of a confusing part of the video there. So I'm just going to skip over that discussion here. Here is another objection that's put forward, like, why is it that in contrast to other objects of knowledge, we can only know phenomenal qualities by experiencing them? So I think that this is another common rebuttal, is to say, look, there's something fishy about these phenomenal qualities, phenomenal concepts. Why is it that unlike everything else, we can only, unlike other physical knowledge, we can only know them by experiencing them? Now, I don't think this is a very good objection from the substance dualists. Remember, the substance dualists think that there's something special about the mind as well. The physicalist here is, in a sense, saying that, yeah, we agree there's something special about the mind, but it's special, and it's not because it's a different substance. It's special because there's certain types of concepts that you can only acquire by being a certain physical state or having certain experiences. So I don't really see how the substance dualist is in some way in a superior position here. We both recognize that there's something a bit different about the mind compared to other things. And somehow the substance dualist is making an issue of that in the physicalist case, as if the physicalist has said, no, minds are just like every other type of physical system. The physicalist doesn't have to say that. They can say that they're a very special type of physical system that has special properties, right? That can give rise to like phenomenal states, which can only be appreciated, through experience and not purely through third-person knowledge. Another way that I would put this is I think it is actually plausible that Mary could have a knowledge of what it is to experience red even without leaving her room. But in order to do that, she can't just have like a list of propositions about color and vision and so forth in her mind, right? I think what she'd actually have to do is combine those concepts together, that knowledge together in the right way, to basically make a mental simulation, a very detailed mental simulation of what it is like to be someone who has that experience. So I think that this idea that Mary can't know what it's like to experience red comes from just imagining that she has like ordinary scientific knowledge. I think in order for her to know this, what she'd have to actually do is like run a mini mental simulation, but like highly detailed, something that probably no human can do. You need like a computer to do it, but even, much more detailed and sophisticated probably than any simulation, like a mini emulation of someone else experiencing color inside her own mind, right? I think that maybe she could actually experience color even without seeing it herself. She could do it like vicariously through the like mini simulation she made. But the thing is that I don't think that substance dualists think about this carefully. That they just think about the physical world as just like a list of descriptions of where atoms are or something like that. But again, the claim of the physicalist is not that the physical world is the same as a description of the physical world. This is, I think, the mistake here. The physicalist is saying that consciousness or phenomenal states, or the mind in general, is identical to particular physical states. They're not saying that it is identical to knowledge of those physical states. You see the difference? One is knowledge of something and the other is the thing itself. The example that I like to give is you could have a full description of photosynthesis and all of the details of how it works, but that doesn't mean you're actually going to produce any sugar, right? Any glucose or oxygen. A description of something doesn't actually produce the thing. It just describes it. In order to produce oxygen and glucose, you actually need to physically instantiate the system that performs photosynthesis. Likewise, a simple description, or even a detailed description of how color vision works is not sufficient to elicit or to bring about an experience of the color red, or having an experience of the color red. You actually need to instantiate that in the right substrate. I'm not saying it has to be like a a biological brain, but it could be a computer simulation or even a mental simulation if hypothetically like you had enough brain power to do that, which again, I don't think anyone does. But you see the point I'm making here. What I'm doing is I'm explaining why it is that certain concepts can only be acquired by experiencing them. It's because essentially there's a difference between a description of something and the thing itself. And in order to, the physicalist says that mental states, including consciousness and like phenomenal states, are certain physical states, and you get them by instantiating those physical states. You don't get them just by having descriptions of them. So that's why Mary has to either make a detailed mental simulation in her head or go outside to instantiate the physical state of having that type of representation. She may have all of the knowledge of the underlying brain state, but she won't have the phenomenal concept. You only get the phenomenal concept by kind of putting that knowledge together in the right way, which you can do by, in her case, going outside or constructing kind of that mental simulation, or maybe on a computer or something. But then her computer would have the experience and she wouldn't, right? You get the point. So I think it's easy for the physicalist to answer this question about why it's distinct, because minds are different. They're not the same as every other physical thing. In order to instantiate their properties, you need to instantiate the physical system that instantiates the actual physical processes. Just by describing things in the abstract from a third-person point of view, you don't get the thing. It's not really that hard to understand, I think. Now, Daniel Dennett kind of says something similar here. This is an objection to the idea that Mary learned something new. And he objects saying, well, look, the crucial premise is she has all the physical information, but you can't really imagine that. No one bothers to imagine that. They just imagine she knows lots of things. And I think he's right on the money here. Now, he doesn't talk about this idea of Mary like actually having a mini simulation of a mind that's seeing red in her brain. But I think that that's actually what she would need in order to truly know all of the physical information. Again, there's a lack of a distinction here between having an abstract propositional description of a physical state and instantiating that physical state. And there's a crucial difference here. Like the physicalist doesn't say that a description of a physical state is all that's needed in order to bring about a mental state. They say that the physical state is what is needed. So you need to actually instantiate it. You need for her to go outside or kind of make a sufficiently detailed simulation. In either case, she doesn't actually have all the physical information, or at least it's not instantiated in the right way. Now, the response to that given here by Howard Robertson is just really bad. She says, look, we shouldn't assume that literally Mary knows every particular physical thing that's going on. She only knows all of the relevant physical science, and it's general scientific knowledge that ought to be enough. But that's just silly. Like, why would you expect it's general scientific knowledge that ought to be enough? The physicalist isn't committed to saying that general scientific knowledge is enough to specify all of the properties of the world. The physicalist says that all physical knowledge, like every physical fact, is necessary to specify all of the properties of the world, right? So this is just silly. This is weakening the claim such that there's no reason for the physicalist to accept that. Well, in other words, it's easy for the physicalist to say that Mary learned something if all she has is general scientific knowledge. Well, of course, like general scientific knowledge isn't nearly enough to get you to know all sorts of things if all you have is general scientific knowledge. So I think that's a very silly objection there. Now, there's a very last point here, which is that the knowledge argument, and according to this statement here, the knowledge argument only gets you to property dualism. It doesn't actually get you to substance dualism. The previous three arguments plausibly do, because, like, for the continuity of self, you need some actual substance that maintains its existence over time. And the introspection and modal arguments both appeal to the idea of a substance existing without like a physical property, without like a physical substrate. The knowledge argument really doesn't say anything about that. It just says that there must be some sort of non-physical property that Mary comes to know when she leaves the room. So it's not really an argument for substance dualism. David gives an argument for why we should infer substance dualism rather than property dualism, or why we should go from property to substance dualism. And I put a couple of these slides in here. To be honest, I can't make head or tail of it. It's only sourced from this one guy here, and there's just not a lot I can say about it. Physical things are metaphysically complete. I'm already a bit lost there. Like, what does that mean exactly? And then we have metaphysical complementarity as a symmetric notion. I've had a look through this. I can't make head or tail of it. So you're just going to have to accept my apologies here. I don't understand. And then he talks about being physical and non-physical phenomenal properties cannot be strictly compresent, which means like co-present. I don't really know why he argues that. So I'm just going to have to say that I don't understand these arguments at the end here for why we should infer substance dualism from the knowledge argument, as distinct from just regular old property dualism, which, by the way, is much more popular than substance dualism. So David Pallmann, for example, he calls himself some weird like materialist dualist or something. I think he's a property dualist, but he might not like that. But he's definitely not a substance dualist. Anyway, I'm going to call that here for the main part of the video. So we've just gone through the 4 arguments that David outlines for substance dualism. Again, I'll just mention them briefly. So he mentioned the appeal to the nature of the self. So particularly the continuity of the self over time, the idea that there must be some sort of, he argues there must be some immaterial self that maintains identity conditions for the self over time. The problem with that is he just kind of ignores all of the arguments that philosophers give that establish how you can identify an object over time. And it seems like all the physicalist has to do is pick your favorite answer to that question and then apply that to persons or minds. Because the dualist has to answer that question anyway for physical objects. They agree that physical objects exist, so they need an answer to that question. We'll just apply that to the case of minds. And really, the only objection they have to that is thought experiments that, like, it just really seems to them that they're identical over time. But the thought experiments are just question begging and worthless. I don't know how you can know that. You only experience what you experience. You don't experience the identity conditions over time. We looked at those, and I think they're incredibly weak. Second argument was the argument from introspection. And really, this was an argument from inconsistent properties. The idea is that we can introspect about the nature of mental properties and see that they are very different to the properties that physical objects have. And we saw here the underlying problem that even if you grant that you can introspect everything and know a great deal, even certainty about mental states by introspecting, that you can't necessarily say the same thing about physical states. And in order to say that the two things are identical, you need to be able to introspect about the one and about the other, and then see, oh, they have all the same. Introspecting about the mental states is not enough if you haven't also been able to do that about the physical states. And the physicalist is just going to say, well, look, you may not think that you're introspecting about a physical state, but you are. Like, you just don't realize it because you don't have enough information. You don't have that knowledge, right? So that whole argument about the inconsistent properties completely collapses when you realize that there's just no substantiation to the idea that you can't introspect about physical states, that's just asserted on the basis of what you can introspect about mental properties. It's fundamentally illogical. You would have to say that you separately can acquire enough knowledge about the two things and establish that they are different, that here's all the physical properties, here's the mental ones, and they don't align. Whereas all they argue is, here are the mental ones, and therefore they don't align. Because they say they have introspective knowledge to the mental ones and they don't to the physical ones. And yet somehow they know enough about the physical properties of physical states to say that they're different. But the physicalist's whole point is you don't realize that you're just introspecting a physical state. So that argument, I think, goes nowhere. Then there's the modal argument, which is really a conceivability argument. The idea is that we can conceive of these scenarios where the mind exists without a body, or where we swap bodies, or where idealism is true and there's no physical system. And conceivability implies possibility. And therefore, if it's possible that the mind could exist without any physical substrate, then if something is physical, it's necessarily physical. Therefore, the mind can't be physical. So we saw that this claim that if something is physical, it must necessarily be physical is dubious. It's not obvious that that's true. You don't have to define you don't have to define a physical object purely in terms of like being made of stuff. You can define it in functional, relational terms and structural terms, which it seems could potentially be instantiated physically or non-physically, at least, again, hypothetically. So I don't agree with that fundamental premise that something that is material is essentially material. But then the key conceivability argument, even if you agree with the point that we can kind of imagine these scenarios of body swapping and so forth, in order to justify the key conceivability premise to go from conceivability to possibility, you have to really strengthen what it is for something to be conceivable. It has to be positively conceivable. You have to be able to work through all of the details and identify these potential hidden contradictions. And it has to be ideally conceivable, so you have to have a full knowledge of the relevant situation. This is what David Pallmann talks about. It's the dualists simply have no way of knowing what is conceivable under those conditions, because those conditions don't prevail, right? And in fact, the examples they give don't meet those criteria. They don't have a positive, detailed conception of a mind without a body. All they do is imagine a mind and then stop, right? That's not actually a positive, detailed conception. That's a a half step. You've imagined one thing and then just sort of stopped. Likewise, for other examples, you haven't actually imagined the details of swapping bodies. You've just imagined it in a crude way, and you're just sort of assuming that some sort of ideal agent would be able to imagine it as well, but you don't actually know that, right? So it's all based on, I think, sort of smoke and mirrors about what is conceivable. Because yeah, if you strengthen conceivability enough, maybe then you can get to the idea that conceivability implies modality, like the right sort of really highly idealized and detailed conceivability. Maybe we agree that implies possibility, but they don't have that sort of conceivability for any of their thought experiments. And also they respond by saying, oh, you're just being too skeptical about modality, then you don't think we can have any modal knowledge, and that's not conceivable. No, it's very easy to give arguments as to why we can have certain types of modal knowledge. We can have certain types of modal knowledge through combinatorial processes of taking bits that we do understand and applying them together in different ways, according with known laws, extrapolating in certain contexts. But that doesn't mean we can have arbitrary modal knowledge. It means that there's going to be limits to our modal knowledge, and generally that's going to be around things we understand well. And the mind existing in like bizarre hypothetical science fiction scenarios is not one of those. So that's not going to be an area where our modal knowledge is going to be very reliable. So that's the modal argument. The final argument was the knowledge argument, which relates to the idea that Mary knows everything about color vision, but she goes outside and still learns something new about what it is to see the color red. So you can dispute that really she does learn anything new, depending on exactly how you define like physical knowledge. But even if she does, the physicalist can deploy the phenomenal concept strategy and say effectively that what Mary acquires when she goes outside is a phenomenal concept, which is a way of looking at a physical system. It's a way of viewing it, but through a different lens. It's a way of viewing a brain state through the lens of being that brain state, right? From a first person perspective instead of a third person perspective. And it's similar to the idea of two different terms having the same referent, but presenting it in different ways, like the morning and the evening star, for example. It's not exactly the same, but it's a similar sort of concept there, the idea of what a phenomenal concept is. And there's nothing really that mystical or strange about that. It's just the idea that minds are kind of special physical systems. They're not like a lot of other things. And they have certain properties which are not otherwise obvious. In order to appreciate those phenomenal properties of physical systems, you need to acquire phenomenal concepts. And you can only do that through either being in that state, or as I argued, maybe Mary could have a sufficiently detailed mental simulation of a mind that then could perceive color vision, and she may be able to come to that knowledge of what it is like to see the color red through that mental simulation. But at that point, it's more than just like knowing the facts. It's being able to instantiate the facts. Again, the physicalist is never claimed that a description of all physical facts is sufficient to account for phenomenal facts. They've said that physical states are sufficient to account for mental states and phenomenal states. There's a difference between a description of a physical state and the physical state itself. And I think the knowledge argument confuses those. It imagines that Mary has all this propositional knowledge, and somehow that should give her phenomenal knowledge as well. The physicalist is simply not required to say that. All they need to say is that the physical state itself, when instantiated, is sufficient to account for everything that happens. And the idea is that phenomenal concepts allow us to understand the different ways of viewing the brain state. There's many different ways to characterize them precisely. I've just given one scenario that I think is somewhat plausible, but there's a very developed literature on that. Anyway, so that brings us to a conclusion. What we had is 4 arguments to substance dualism, all of which appeal to thought experiments and sort of hypothetical thought experiments, and appeals to intuition. All of which I think are highly suspect just on the face of it, because how reliable are our intuitions about any of these things anyway? So that's more of a meta objection. And I think that this is a really bad way to do philosophy, just purely by appealing to these sort of very abstract and very far removed thought experiments from things that we can ever actually experience or have experienced. It's not like some ethical thought experiments, which are like, not that far removed. They're just slightly idealized, like swapping bodies or, the Mary example. Are so far removed from anything realistic that I don't know why you'd trust our intuitions about these things anyway. Anyway, so that's what we have. Those are the arguments for substance dualism. I think they're terrible. They're not at all convincing. And we haven't even got to, which I did prepare slides for, but we'll go through it another day. We haven't even got to all the objections to substance dualism and arguments for materialism. We'll do that another day. But hopefully I've presented a plausible materialist sort of pushback to the arguments presented in David's video there. So before we finish off, I'll just have a quick look at chat, and then we'll we'll finish up for the evening. So thanks for listening, everyone. Sorry I wasn't very interactive today, but it was more of a pre-prepared presentation. I just decided to do it as a live stream. Yeah, needless to say, a lot of people are not very fond of these arguments. I don't want to say that the way I've responded to these arguments is the only way. There's other responses one can give as well, but I've just presented an approach that I think is reasonable. Yes, needless to say, Nathan, there's a lot of things here we're going to disagree about minds. We'll have to have another discussion about this. I mean, I think that if you're an eliminativist about a lot of mental phenomena, then most of these arguments don't even start to get off the ground. But I personally don't find strong eliminativist views very plausible, which is why I've given instead reductive physicalist accounts of most of these things. But anyway, that can be another discussion. No worries. So I think this is a good one to end on here. So I appreciate that some of this stuff is a bit deep. You can go and watch the original video or parts thereof if you're interested. And he does goes through things a bit more slowly than I did. I kind of deliberately wanted to go through things a bit quickly because this is a response to that video. And so I don't want to have to present everything slowly and then respond to it, because then it's going to be a 9-hour plus my response video. And then, that gets a bit much. So yeah, feel free to rewatch or jump around or go back to his video and things like that to get your head around this. But I hope that this was sort of useful for some people. Now, I'd like to give an invitation to David. I would suggest maybe, you can be free agent, but maybe giving a response video to this is probably not the best way to continue this discussion. I'd love to invite you to my channel, as I have in the past, to talk about this. Maybe be good to wait until I've done the part 2 where I go through the responses, but we can have a nice chat about this. Structured debate, unstructured, whatever you like. I could come on your channel if you prefer. I'd love to continue the discussion because I think there's some interesting issues here. Or anyone else, if you want to talk about substance dualism, I think it's an interesting topic. I don't think much of it as a position, but I think it raises interesting issues about thought and consciousness and reductionism and stuff like that. So yeah, always keen to talk about this for people who are thoughtful. All right, I'll leave it there. Thanks everyone for watching. I will go through the second part to this another time, hopefully in a week or two. And also, if you're interested, there's more videos. So I want to do a video responding to some of the stuff that Nathan's been talking about mental representations, and say why he's wrong about that. And there's about apologetics coming up in a week as well. So look forward to that. So lots of content coming. So yeah, stay tuned. Take care. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.